Welcome to another episode of Bitcoin Magazine Live. I am your host, Q, coming to you from my mother's basement, and I'm joined by my one-lettered co-host extraordinaire, P. How goes it?
It goes fantastically. Haven't shaved in a few days. It's coming in strong. I'm trying to decide if I'll go with the full beard, the little Hitler mustache, or something else entirely. We'll see.
No, we're doing a company-wide Movember. So
Oh shit, I wasn't told.
I'm letting you know, everyone in the office, it's happening. Get ready, all you
Well, now I can't do it.
prepubescent children who can't grow facial hair. Get ready for the adults to
destroy you.
My whole life I've been growing this bad boy, so yeah, I don't have much of a shot here.
How many times have you shaved, Chris? Like, I feel like you can count it. Yeah.
Like on one hand, maybe.
We got a jam-packed episode for you guys today. It is Wednesday, so we will have a new episode of Fedwatch in the final hour. That'll kick off at 3 p.m. Eastern time. And then, of course, we'll be joined by Eric Yakes, the author of Seventh Property, a friend of the show. And then, of course, we'll kick things off with news and notes. But before we do that, I do want to remind everyone that tickets for Bitcoin 2023 are on sale now. Use promo code BMLive and get 10% off of your tickets today. Whoa, a lot of stuff just got deleted. Okay, cool. Elon is going to seal the deal. Twitter locks employee stock accounts in anticipation of closing a deal with Elon Musk. Elon Musk looks to be buying Twitter at an agreed upon price of $44 billion, also known as 2,291,666 Bitcoin. That 666 at the end is really ominous. Maybe it is a good thing he didn't buy Bitcoin with all that money. I think this is inevitable so long as Elon doesn't want to really allow this to drag out in court. I know that a lot of people are excited about this. A lot of people are upset about this. Who knew that Elon Musk would be the most polarizing figure of 2023 or 2022?
Jesus. I don't know what a pig year is or which year we're in.
Figure.
Nailed it. Yeah, man, this is, I'm going to be super interested to see how this all plays out from the perspective of censorship and what policies may or may not change on Twitter. What do you guys think is going to happen?
I think he's going to attack the bots, but it would be funny if he attacks the bots only for other people's accounts. Because what if he looks at it and he's like, wait, 70% of my followers are bots? We'll leave those in, but we'll get rid of all the other ones.
I mean, I honestly I would love today being on Twitter, dealing with all the bots on all the different Bitcoin Magazine accounts. That was a nightmare. I feel like there are more bots now that this whole issue has been brought to light. And then Twitter is like, all right, you know what, Elon, this is your problem now. We're going to turn off all the guardrails we had. And in turn, you get to deal with the mess that is the bots. I don't think the bot problem gets solved. I almost even want to go so far as to say the censorship problem probably doesn't get resolved as much as we'd like it to. I don't necessarily think this changes whether or not I use Twitter or how I interact with Twitter. And I don't feel and I'll speak for the two of you, I don't feel like either of you, this is going to change your relationship with Twitter. But for other people, it just might. And I wonder if that will change the overall experience if you start to see, I don't know, 50% of users or 25% of users either drop off or stop using it. Mind you, not the bot users, because that's another 70% of all users.
Yeah, Twitter is... it's pretty crazy how many bots there are on Twitter. It is awful and incredibly annoying. I don't understand why they can't have more effective policies. My only conclusion is that as you have intimated, it drives so much of the traffic that they don't want to be too restrictive. Otherwise, it would, lower the amount of money that influencers or Twitter are making. I don't know. We'll see. I think it's all just kind of pontification at this point. But I think this. Well, Chris, unless you have anything to say. No? All right, Chris is shaking his head. This plays into our next story very nicely, which is that, I don't know if you guys remember, Jack Dorsey announced the Bluesky initiative, which was basically an attempt to make an open source and decentralized and more kind of free version of Twitter. Now, that was announced, 2 or 3 years ago even, and they have been working on it steadily, and they just announced the release of ADX. The design of this is starting to solidify, and there is major progress on the Bluesky initiative. Specifically, they've released the AT protocol. X stood for experimental. They say that Bluesky was created to build a social protocol. In the spring, we released ADX, the very first iteration of the protocol. Over the summer, we improved and simplified ADX's design, and today we're sharing a preview of what's to come. So, they released a preview. The AT protocol is a federated social networking protocol. So we talked a couple days ago about how we've got Twitter, which is fully centralized. They hold all the accounts, they hold all the information, they mediate the interactions, what you see on your feed. Then you've got something like Mastodon, which is a more federated model where you have these sort of hubs, you have hub and spokes in terms of accounts. I would love to see a fully decentralized system that was produced by Bluesky, which would be something closer to what Nostr is. However, they're releasing their own federated protocol, and people are going to start playing around with it. They've got this preview out. Hopefully, something significant will come of it. You can go and apply for the Bluesky app beta program now. You can join the waitlist, and I would highly encourage everyone who's listening to do that, because I think with the backing of Dorsey and the Bluesky initiative, this has the potential to be a significant competitor to Twitter, and potentially a more free and open one.
Yeah, I think it'd be the coolest move of Dorsey leaves his baby that is Twitter only to beat it with a new protocol and a new experience. I think it would be a baller ass move. He left at the top, so I guess maybe that's dumping on retail if you're a Twitter stockholder. I apologize to those people, but really cool to build a company and then basically to beat it with its next competition by something that he builds.
And there's one other thing I'll say, which is just to elaborate a tiny bit more, which is what the AT protocol is it's a federated system in the same way that when we talk about the Lightning Network and you've got all these different implementations made by different companies. You've got LND by Lightning Labs. You've got Eclair by AsyncQ or Async, and then you've got Core Lightning by Blockstream. The idea is that with the AT protocol, any entity that wants to use this federated model produced by Bluesky could connect to the app and create these interconnected systems. So you could have multiple companies making these federated social networking systems that all interacted and can intercommunicate, which would be really cool. So let's keep going, though. What we got next?
Yeah, so the House of Cards is coming down. What do I mean by that? So after 125 years after foundation, the German construction company Wolff-Hoch is insolvent. After 130 years of foundation, the German confectionery manufacturer Bodetta is insolvent. 156 years after foundation, German automotive supplier Borgers is insolvent. And 170 years after foundation, a German soap manufacturer Kappes is insolvent. Well, what's the significance of this? Well, obviously, they're all German companies, but all of these insolvencies have happened within the last 24 hours. So the fiat house of cards is coming to a crumble. I mean, all of these companies have survived 2 world wars. They survived a Great Depression. They survived the Korean War, the Vietnam War, all these various wars, the
hyperinflation,
86 crisis, the internet.com boom and bust, the 2008 great financial crisis. So they survived all of these things, and now they're coming to a head right now in 2022, and all within the last 24 hours. Why is this important? More so, obviously Germany is the powerhouse or the manufacturing hub for the EU and much of the world as well. And the EU is kind of lifting the debt burden of all of the EU nations there, as we commonly refer to them as the pigs, which is Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain, are much more heavily indebted. And basically, I know Christine Lagarde, our favorite banker out of the EU, is saying that they're going to do everything in their power to keep the EU together and not anti-fragmentation techniques. Basically, they cannot afford to have Germany leave the EU because they're propping up bad debt of these countries that have taken out bad debt. And at the cost of this right now, they're killing their own manufacturing. And when the big powerhouse of your economy goes crumbling, this is not a good thing. P and Q, anything else you guys want to add there?
I just, like you said it so perfectly, these companies have lasted through the entire period of World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, hyperinflation post World War II. We are truly at the end of the rope, and we cannot emphasize this enough. Like, this isn't us trying to be doom and gloomers. There's a degree of this where you are kind of seeing in real time certain things come to the end of their line and just end. This is just the first domino. Maybe like the fourth domino, but we're still early in like the whole series of dominoes elaborately falling all over the world.
Yeah, I completely agree.
But also, Chris, can you define for us what a convection is?
It is sugar.
Oh, so it's just a sugar refinery.
Yeah, sugar refinery. Yep.
Got it. Cool.
Sugary treats. What do we got next?
Wait, does that mean the Haribo gummy factory is like done? Because that's out of Germany.
It might be. I don't know where this connects, but maybe it's a good chance.
Yo, if all these fucking bakers, Quantitative Easy, just took away Haribo gummies, I'm gonna be pissed.
You better have some capital on the side. You might have to spend some Bitcoin to bail out some companies.
Dude,
all right, here first.
I said 6 months ago it was a great time to start stocking up on Sriracha. I'm going to do some due diligence, but we may be Haribo gummy maxis very soon, guys.
Let's fucking go.
What's the next story we got?
let's talk BlackRock because they're going to just ESG themselves to death. Missouri now becomes the third state to pull funds from BlackRock. Missouri will withdraw $500 million from BlackRock over their asset managers ESG push. If I remember correctly, it was Louisiana first, Mississippi, and now Missouri. Does that sound correct?
I thought Texas also pulled out funds, but I thought it was Texas,
I'm sure they
Louisiana,
did.
And Missouri.
So it's Texas. I think it is worth noting that BlackRock does have almost $10 trillion of
it's
assets.
Actually, it was down to 8.2. They had to write down their books because they've lost
Fair.
a lot.
The point being,
there's
a T in that, and we're talking about the hundreds of millions, which is a huge sum of money. I'm not saying this is insignificant. I'm just saying it is like a drop in the bucket is more than how much BlackRock has lost or bled during this. This is less than 1%. This is less than 0.5%. This might actually be less than 0.1% of all their assets under management. So it's significant to us because we like to bash on ESG. We all read through the bullshit that is ESG. It's nice to see some states, some people at least speaking out their mind as well. Ultimately, though, I think it's worth, if we can find this number out of how much they still have of assets under management that still qualify as ESG, because we've seen essentially like $1 billion to $1.5 billion taken out of their fund, which is that's not even 1%.
I disagree, actually. I think that I hear what you're saying. And I think from a monetary or from a specifically financial perspective, that is true. But I think it is much more significant from a signaling perspective. The fact that large states are telling BlackRock to go fuck themselves is significant in and of itself. And I think that's really cool.
Yes, but let me counter that by saying, how is this not just virtue signaling by them to their base? Because they still have other funds with BlackRock. They're just taking their money out of their ESG fund, but they still have other pension funds tied in with BlackRock. So they're not really saying fuck off BlackRock. They're just saying, hey, the anti-ESG guys, look what we did. I.e. that's virtue signaling. It's just a virtue signal that we like because we agree with it.
I think Texas was going to be a full withdrawal from BlackRock, but I see with what you're saying here, Q, that definitely does make sense. But it is a change of sentiment. I mean, when you're starting to pull funds from those, it's hard to, you have to then back it up with returns. And I don't know if that's going to be the case.
Totally. Like, this is, Pete, to your point, like, this is a huge step. This would have been unheard of 5 years ago. Yeah. But the fact that this is happening is significant, but it can, and to me kind of does read like this is just virtue signaling. But like, what do you call virtue signaling when it's a virtue you agree with genuinely?
Well, it can still be virtue signaling, but I think it's still, I hear what you're saying. But I think it's still significant. I think it still tells people that, we're not interested in ESG.
Fair.
But
Let's
wanna
talk
keep it-
Texas.
yeah, let's talk Texas. Chris, what do you got for us?
Yeah, so Riot announces a 1 gigawatt mining facility in Corsicana, Cavaro County, Texas. So to give some guys some like concept of size, this will be the largest mining facility in North America. 1 gigawatt is actually a fuck ton of power. So to give you an example, 1 gigawatt power facility can power about 750,000 homes. So it is a lot of power. Obviously, Riot was saying this is the first 1 gigawatt facility that's ever been approved in the ERCOT area of Texas. The company acknowledges this is the first gigawatt load ever approved by ERCOT and is a testament to Riot's partnership-driven approach and commitment to transparency, as well as well-capitalized position. So I think this is huge. I think this is really, really cool. I know this comes off the back of Elizabeth Warren, we said earlier in the week, was kind of going and trying to pitch to Texan officials saying that they should not be doing this. They should not be using Bitcoin mining. I think Elizabeth Warren should cry harder and stay in Massachusetts, but that's just my personal opinion. It's very funny that she cares what Texas is doing. It makes it seem like if Texas does the right thing and does a good job, why doesn't Massachusetts do it? They have a lot of power based, especially in the Boston area, to support the city like Boston. So yeah, I think this is awesome. It's very cool. And it proves to Riot that the 1 gigawatt facility being approved, obviously Texas officials saw the benefit in tax revenue, as well as benefiting the grid, as well as helping out. I know last year when we had that freak snowstorm that like took a lot of Texas offline for multiple weeks on end, and the miners were able to stop producing power and basically give it back to the grid. So I think this is a win across the board. It's going to be interesting with hash price continuing to go up while Bitcoin price remaining low, that they must have a really, really good deal for a power purchase agreement. I think last time I checked, to like break even on the best rigs of mining, you need like 6 or 7 cents at this current like Bitcoin price and hash rate. And that's only getting squeezed further as hash rate appears to keep going up. So any thoughts there, guys?
No, I agree with your assessment. I think I want to see more of this. I want to see nuclear powered facilities. I hope Texas is the one to bring that to bear. I think that it continues to be the level of, to take something from our earlier conversation, virtue signaling and posturing that exists around, energy production and the kind of hand wringing and attempts to constrain how people who have paid for electricity or who want to pay for electricity can use that electricity is just so hypocritical. I love to see companies being encouraged to do what's best for them and the state and ultimately the environment, which is to say Bitcoin mining.
Yeah, and the one last thing, I know a lot of people have complained about noise from Bitcoin mining. Obviously, Riot is a mining company. They know how to insulate. They know how to do things to reduce the sound. But also, this is great for the end consumer. So the people that are buying electricity that live in ERCOT, their price for electricity should go down because there's a buyer of last resort, which is the Riot mining facility. So it helps keep their energy prices competitive. And what I mean by that, it forces them, like the deflationary aspect of like energy prices going down. So you imagine living in Texas being like, oh, my energy bill used to be $80 a month or $100 a month, and now it's going down to, half that or a fraction of that. So I think even the end consumers like this, as long as they deal with the noise, which Riot is a mining company and they've done this before. So
is that really an issue that people complain about though? Because like,
have you not seen these have you not seen the press conferences?
Yeah, people out of New York.
Outside of,
yeah.
It was like a city hall meeting, I think in the city of Niagara or just outside Niagara Falls. And they were like this old, like 75-year-old like lady, like, it's too loud. All the miners, I can't sleep. It's so loud.
I will caveat it that when they were going into what's it called, behind the meter, that what they were doing is they're going into an old power plant that was not retrofit for mining. So it's basically like this old thing, not soundproof. It's kind of like really old plant, and they were turning it back on. So I'm assuming it was like really echoing into the valley or into that surrounding area. So
I'd be so curious to hear if that's actually just like bullshit FUD though, because you remember when people were like, oh my God, Lake Seneca's boiling, because there was a power plant there that was, plugged in like 5 Bitcoin miners. And then it became this huge news story. Everybody picked it up. Politicians were like, you see, they're boiling the goddamn oceans. And then all you had to do was to look back through like the historical temperatures of the lake and immediately see that like, oh, interesting. It turns out when they plugged those miners in, the temperature actually went down, which of course has nothing to do with the miners, but it just completely undercut like everything that was being claimed. But people loved it. I feel like this is the same thing. It's like somebody like, went like inside the factory to like one specific miner and like held the little decibel meter and was like, you see, it's so loud. And then that's what we're hearing about.
I will say, given the fact that the main source of this argument was this old lady at City Hall, like, can you please show me one old person whose hearing is actually better when they got older to the point where it's like so sensitive that a Bitcoin miner like blocks away?
Like, my hearing.
I can hear the faintest buzzing in the back of I can't.
My hearing.
No, Grandma, that's just your hearing aid buzzing.
Chris, I found it really helpful when we were talking about this story. When you were kind of like explaining us the size and scope of other sort of factories, just given how, while this is 1 gigawatt, that is like the micro penis of all energy factory sizes.
No, 1 gigawatt's a lot. So I was using the wrong system. Megawatts, it would be small. Gigawatt is a fuck ton. Like this is 1,000 megawatt plant. So it is a very large facility.
This is on the scale of, genitalia size. This would be a macro penis sized.
Macro penis, not micro. Okay.
Yep.
Got it.
Exactly.
Cool. Thank you for setting me up for that. I'm going to cut the line and I'm going to move my story now next because it makes more sense here than at the end. But a report came out that the Bitcoin Mining Council members make up about 45.4% of the global hash rate. Obviously, these members include companies from Riot, Marathon, Block, Hive, so on and so forth. My question for the two of you is this something to be aware of, something to have any concern over, or is this just something that ultimately doesn't matter?
I guess I'll start with this. So I know during the block size war, there was a thing called the New York Agreement, to fill in our listeners. And it was basically when a bunch of large companies went behind closed doors and they were trying to make an agreement to basically try and appease the mining community, as well as the large blockers, the small blockers, which are now known as Bitcoin, the Bitcoin that we have now. And it was kind of a backdoor dealing that a lot of people were very frustrated with. Obviously, the small blockers
unite.
Small blockers won out, and thankfully we did, because otherwise there'd be a large centralizing issue with it. With that being said, this is obviously, they're out in the open. Anyone can join. There's no restrictions. So it's a little bit more open, but I guess a lot of people in the Bitcoin community, especially a lot of the OGs, feel that this is a risk of like, oh, this is going to become like a society or a club or something where they demand that you have to do X, Y, and Z for your mining operation, which I can definitely see the scare of a lot of the Bitcoin OGs this coming to fruition.
Yeah, Chris, while we're just doing this, just again, for people who aren't aware, the small blockers, obviously, like this was in regard to block size, hence the block size war. Like, could we just define a little bit of what is the priority? How does this affect nodes, node sizes, and why it would have potentially led to centralization if we had larger block sizes?
Yeah, so basically the only ones that could run nodes would be large corporations, because as you increase the block size, every block coming in can be that much larger in data size. So then only the Googles, the Amazons, the Apples, the Facebooks could run large data servers, or the only ones that have like enough economic capital to do so. By keeping the block size small, you can run it on, an old laptop or, a Raspberry Pi 4 particular, to keep the whole blockchain basically. So by keeping it small.
I want to go into a little bit more nuance there. And it's not that they were talking about making it so that only large entities could afford to, run a full node. The issue is that if the block size increased even slightly, it would increase the cost it would basically push out the lower edge of the market. So it would make it so that even if it was the majority of people could still run nodes, it's really important that that we're creating systems and incentive systems and infrastructure that supports the largest amount of decentralization and censorship resistance possible. So even if the average person still would have been able to run a node, it would have edged out a significant portion of lower, less expensive nodes. And that's, the most significant thing. And
also the Lightning Network helped to be another solution to the overall problem that was being discussed, which was an influx of transactions. How are we going to do this? How are we going to scale?
Yep. All right. So for our next story, it is flabbergasting to me. I'm flabbergasted, I should say.
This is a real headline. This is
Yeah.
a real story.
Yeah. So JP Morgan is apparently appointing a former Celsius executive to its team, specifically the former director of crypto regulation from Celsius, Aaron Loving, has joined JP Morgan Chase and Company as an executive director of digital assets regulatory policy. This is according to his LinkedIn profile, but it's hard to imagine that he would put this up and have it not be true. Now, for those of you who have been not living under a rock in the space, Celsius is obviously a company that very recently froze all of its customers' assets. The CEO, Alex Machinsky, has left in disgrace after taking about $10 million out of the, or selling $10 million of his assets in their token and basically absconding. I don't know if this is a revolving door situation or what the fuck is going on here, but a person who has personally presided over the regulatory decisions that allowed a company like Celsius to operate in the way that it operated, depriving hundreds of thousands of people who were trusting the company with from their Bitcoin. It just seems ridiculous. Like, where the fuck are we living? Why are we in a clown world? How the fuck did this happen?
I mean, they're just, they're just learning how to bankrupt a company. I mean, JP Morgan only got fined like $980 million for like fraudulently messing with the gold metal markets. But, they still made $4.2 billion in profit. So, hey, it's called a win.
Yeah, maybe they're hiring him because they're like, oh shit, dog, you figured out how to steal everybody's Bitcoin and nobody's gone to jail. You're fucking hired. They're like, we need you to do what you did over there, over here. Like, get in here. Let's fucking go.
You are a perfect fit for our company culture. Like, there's a degree of this where you have to ask yourself, like, do they know what they're doing? And if so, like, how or why do we just accept that this is, I don't know.
I'll tell you why.
It would have been more interesting, in my opinion, if this was actually like a U.S. government office, because that's more commonplace. Like, you do see criminals get hired by, like, who's the character in Catch Me If You Can, who like genuinely, like, he defrauded the government, and then
how dare you besmirch his good name? I have no idea who the fuck he is.
Exactly.
But he was played by Leonardo DiCaprio, and that movie was thrilling.
Dude, exactly. See, like, let's just call it Leo 2.0. But like, Leo 2.0 eventually got hired by the US government because he was so good at what he did that the US government was like, all right, fuck it. Like, they're going to be more like you. We'd rather have you on our team than not. But this is JP Morgan hiring Celsius. It's like, I don't know what, like, the evil version of Justice League just hired the Joker all of a sudden. Like, he was a free agent and now the Joker just joined them. I don't know. I'm making a lot of stretches here, but this is just really fishy. This is really fishy. I wouldn't trust any cryptocurrency product out of JP Morgan as a result of this now.
Let the record show that Q just called JP Morgan Chase the Avengers. So I don't know where his
No,
head's
I
at
called
here.
No. I called them the opposite of Justice League.
The opposite of Justice League. Okay, fair enough.
I forgot what they're called.
The Evil League of Evil.
The League of Evil or Legion of Doom, something like that.
Who cares?
All right. Chris, let's go down to Brazil.
So our boy Warren Buffett backed Nubank about a year ago, and it's launching its own shitcoin in Brazil. So Nubank said today it will launch its own token in the first half of 2023. So Warren Buffett says he hates crypto, so it's called rat poison squared, which I agree with. Crypto is that. So he'd rather just dump it on the Brazilian people and just completely ignore Bitcoin. So that's just my 2 cents there.
How long until Warren Buffett hires Mashinsky?
I don't know. I mean,
you've done more to harm the crypto space than anyone. You must work for me.
Let's be honest. I mean,
flawless.
Many people learned a lot from Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, but they like Warren Buffett's 92, Charlie Munger is 96, 97. Like, people have been saying any day now, and they're still kicking.
Dude,
they did a deal with the devil.
I'm sorry, but when you get to a certain level, the elites use enough human babies to suck their bloods and live for longer.
Look,
Plus,
those,
like,
those,
they definitely,
look,
they
these crimes,
definitely have the
Q,
cure for cancer.
Q, I got to stop you right
amongst
there,
them.
man. These are allegedly sucking the blood from,
Right.
you know,
Sorry.
human children. You can't just throw unfounded claims out there like this. Allegedly. But my friends, let's go to our guest. We have Eric Yakes coming on in just a second. I want to remind everybody that if you have not bought a ticket for Bitcoin 2023 yet, you can use code BMLive to save 10% off of your ticket. Bitcoin 2022 was absolutely incredible, and Bitcoin 2023 promises to be even more amazing. It is the largest Bitcoin event in the world. Your brain will explode, your face will melt off, be there, or you will regret it for the rest of your life. We also, of course, have the print mag, which is out. We've got another issue coming out soon, so you should get the current one while you still can, because everyone is a collector's item. My friends, we're going to go to a quick commercial break, and then we'll be back with Eric Yakes.
Thank you for sticking through those commercial breaks, and I am excited to introduce our guest today, friend of the show, author of the best Bitcoin book you could possibly read. And if you have not, this is your homework assignment for the week, The Seventh Property, Bitcoin and the Financial Revolution. Eric Yakes, welcome back to the show.
What's going on, fellas?
Oh, I missed the most important thing, my fellow mom's basement dweller.
Yeah, I saw that on the tweet. That was pretty funny.
Eric, how goes it, man? I gave you a light introduction for our audience. What else would you say about yourself to let them know who the heck you are?
That's pretty much it, man. Like my background, and it was kind of like beginning of 2020. I decided to jump into this industry, and I wrote the book, kind of geared people with a background in finance and economics, but it ended up spreading pretty widely. It's been used as a resource by a lot of different people. I kind of geared it to be very holistic in terms of what I cover. I cover how the banking system works. I get a little bit more technical into how Bitcoin works and give some explanations around that, as well as I would be pretty measured with what I was, and not too much of like a moon boy with it, and just say like, hey, look, Bitcoin's not perfect. We got a long road ahead of us. We're gonna get there, but Bitcoin as well. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Other than that, I'm just kind of working up a business, and I talk to you guys on the internet.
Eric, your audio is kind of choppy. Is there any way you can increase your bandwidth?
Let me crap. Yeah,
I'm gonna take that as a no. That was a
kind
deep
of a
sigh.
choppy. I hopped in.
You're like. Also, if you can change your audio settings, Chris, if you can let him know how he might do that, that would be awesome. My first question for you, as you get that fixed, is What are the first 6 properties? My understanding is your book is called the Bitcoin, the 7th property. You're frozen, or you're pretending to be frozen because my question is so piercing that you're
A fun
intimidated by
fact:
it.
there are only 5
Yeah, I'm sorry,
chapters
guys.
in the book.
This is really choppy.
Dun dun dun.
Hold on. It looks
Well, one
like
thing you can try.
1 second.
All right. Well, while we wait for that and hopefully get that resolved, Q, why don't you give us a walkthrough of what Eric's book is about and why you love it and why you sleep with it under your pillow every night. Excuse me.
I mean, these are factual statements. First and foremost, I mean, he quotes 2 of the most brilliant minds of the 21st century in Mike Tyson and Kanye West. They each introduce every single chapter. These quotes alone put this book on just a completely different level, because somehow they're both talking about Bitcoin as far back as the early 90s. So I also really appreciate just the historical context that's provided, especially about the history of banking, how goldsmiths were the early bankers, how that sort of transitioned into fractional reserve banking, and how that has just continuously been a cycle that's been rinsed and repeated over and over again throughout different generations, different societies, different iterations of fiat money. The properties themselves, and Eric, I hope you don't take offense to me saying it like this, are the same properties you pretty much would read in any article, book detailing like what are the characteristics of money. And I'll give Eric the credit of the idea of being censorship resistant was I think very early on. Eric's book was the first place that I really read and learned that from. And we've seen it, especially this year, how vitally important having censorship resistant money can be, being able to spend it freely when and how you want to. But I think I just spoiled the whole book.
Nah. Am I doing better now, fellas?
Ooh, it's still pretty bad, to be honest. Let's try one other thing. Why don't we try turning your camera off and then you having audio only? We'll see if that works. Chris, can you help facilitate that as we go forward? Thanks for sticking with us, my friends. Sorry for the challenges.
Can you guys hear
Eric,
me?
are you there? Yes, we can.
Is this better?
It is actually. Let's try sticking with that. People will only be able to see Q and my ugly mugs, but we can still talk to you and ask you questions, and they can hear you.
All right, cool. All right, what were we talking about?
We're talking about what's your favorite Kanye West
monetary
quote?
properties. The Kanye West ones.
Just like in general, what's your favorite Kanye West quote?
Okay. Well, you said recently, I tweeted it. That was like gap deal fell through. And he like,
why would I take
obviously,
financial advice from people who are poorer than me?
Yeah, that one was solid. I really liked that one. He was on like CNBC, and you could tell like Kanye just rolled into like a board meeting and was just saying crazy shit to a bunch of board execs, and they're like, "We can't deal with this guy." And then he was just like, "Yeah, you're all poorer than me," and that was a good one. I love that.
Let's clue P in, because P actually can't read. This is a surprise to most people, but he did not develop that skill. It's quite necessary. Oh, I know how much P hates this, but I'm gonna let us rock like this now. Walk P through a little bit of the 6 properties that are found just in money historically.
Yeah. So there's like, it is somewhat of a vague concept, but there's just speaking like 6 commonly accepted properties of money, and that's scarcity is the primary, durability, widely accepted, which is kind of like the last one that all the other ones are dependent on. Portability can be easily moved. Fungibility, it's like for like between each consecutive unit of it. divisibility can be easily grouped and divided. So those are the 6 commonly accepted. And, money throughout history was ultimately, it was any sort of good that naturally emerged in like private markets. And when we look at primitive forms of money, these comparisons are really obvious because there was a lot of different primitive forms of money that we can assess based around that. Nick Szabo actually did a lot of great writing. His piece on Nakamoto Institute, Gelling Out, is like a really great review on how those distinctions were made between different communities over time. And, people gravitated to maintain these properties that allowed them to function as money well. And, the argument that I make in the book around 7th property is that, we kind of have this general framework and, some people have different ideas of what that framework is and the definitions are somewhat loose. But, one thing that is certain is when we look at money in the future, it should have a property of immutability. And we should be viewing it from that perspective. So when we look at all these qualities and characteristics of Bitcoin and what make it so valuable, is the decentralization of the mining network or of the nodes or, whatever framework you want to look at it from. It's ultimately like 3 kind of primary functions in which financial intermediaries today get involved with money. And that's, it's storage, it's verification, and transfer in different forms. So if we can have those functions decentralized, which is what Bitcoin does, then we can ultimately achieve property of immutability. So, whether it's Bitcoin or something 50, 100 years from now, or we have some new technology emerge, whatever it is, within that framework of, what defines something as a monetary property, I think that we should be including that concept of immutability because we've innovated upon that. We've now created something that not only is, immutable, but it's actually even more efficient forms of money because typically throughout history, that was a trade-off. And we don't have to deal with that trade-off anymore now. And, it's like a true innovation of Bitcoin.
Pete, do you feel as though you now understand money better?
100%.
Will you stop wasting your money buying dog food for yourself?
Well, I do have a dog. Oh, for myself.
For yourself. No, you got to feed the dog, man.
I got to feed the dog. My wife did put a label on the dog food that says dog food, not for human consumption, which I was offended by and felt attacked. But
she also put that on her shoes.
You eat dog food?
Eat dog food is a stretch. I have partaken of the sacrament, which is the dog food.
He's the guy who will host a dinner party for you, and then you'll show up and you'll be like, "This is so delicious! Like, what is this?" And like, I'll finish what you're eating, and then I'll tell you what it is. And then he'll walk you through every dish, and it'll be some assortment of bug protein, dog food, and then of course, like the tackiest move of all. Oh yeah, those chicken wings you were eating? Yeah, those were vegan chicken wings.
That's the worst one. No, none of that's going to happen. Anyone who
what does that even? It's a vegan chicken wing,
dude. Has this never happened to you? I got really mad at a friend who did this, but like they ordered a bunch of Chinese food and they got orange chicken, and I ate it. I was like, oh my god, this is delicious. This is delicious, and it was vegan. Like it's fake meat.
They just press it out of a mold.
It's like Impossible Burger, but for chicken.
Sure,
I didn't even know that existed.
Yeah, I mean,
cool.
Yeah. P served it to me once. I was very upset.
You loved it.
Well, what was it? What happened to the Impossible Burger CEO? He arrested at it was like an SEC.
He ate someone's face.
I tweeted about it forever ago.
It was the CFO.
CFO, that's what
it was. And he was, I think, like tripping balls at a music festival and just like took a chomp out of someone's face.
Like, that did not happen.
This is a real story, Pete. Did you not hear about this?
No, I did not.
Oh yeah.
No, I tweeted about it. I was like, I'm gonna go eat an Impossible Burger just as that happened.
That makes sense to me. I would 100% do that.
Arrested for biting a man's nose. Douglas Ramsey.
Somebody said no. He bite the nose, not bit. He bite the nose. But
I believe it was after a football game, not a music festival. So he must have been drunk, not high.
These are the details that you come to this show to hear about.
Well, what I'm curious about is like, what mind state do you have to be to, in a drunken fight, think, let me use my teeth and get my teeth involved in this fight? Because that to me is like my biggest fear, is having a tooth knocked out. So my question is, if you either of you are fighting dirty,
That's
like
exactly
what is your
it. Like to be an animal.
So,
No
Eric,
wonder he doesn't
I think
eat
this
animals.
is. I think I'm glad we talked about this, because what I want to know is, how does Bitcoin fix this? I'm looking
Cannibalism
inquisitively
or
at the
Oh, the
camera in
impossible
case you
meat.
can't see
beyond
it.
meat?
And the nose biting specifically.
I don't know. Honestly, I think Bitcoin's probably going to create more guys who are biting noses at SEC flips, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But
Interesting.
yeah, I think in terms of the, I don't know. I mean, the guy sounds like a cool guy. He probably was just like didn't give a fuck. Yeah, I have no idea how Bitcoin is going to affect official meat. And like honestly, my take on that shit is like, if you can create something that tastes exactly the same as a ribeye to me, and I know no difference, then I mean, nutritional quality is a thing that I'm kind of indifferent to it. I don't really give a shit. I don't think it's there yet, but I'd be down.
Fascinating.
So would you eat? Okay, let me ask you this, Eric. Taste, nutrition, like is the same as a regular beef steak, but would you rather eat a 3D printed version of a ribeye or a cricket protein version of the ribeye?
Oh, dude, I gotta go with I don't know. That's tough. I gotta go with 3D printed. Crickets are just fucking disgusting. I couldn't do that.
Did you? So we talked about this a little bit yesterday, and I'd love your thoughts on this. But there, I guess, was a story coming out of the Netherlands where government officials are going to grade school students in their classroom and starting to explain which bugs are edible and which bugs have high nutritional content. And the sort of pontification off of this is that it could lead to eventually, in like 20 years down the line, the government having an easier time convincing a generation to switch from real meat to bug meat, because they've started to sort of put it in their mind from such an early age that these are acceptable things. Are you comfortable with the government brainwashing children into eating bugs? And what would you do if your future children came home one day and asked you to stop eating meat and start eating crickets with them?
Dude, even there's like this whole world going on. Like, I don't even fucking understand how any of this stuff happens or where it happens or what's going on. But yeah, my kids aren't gonna eat bugs. Yeah, my kids probably aren't gonna be in a public school either.
Interesting. Did you go to public school?
No, I didn't. And obviously, it's like it's a luxury for a lot for pretty much most people. I think it's like the percentage of private schools. I saw this stat not too long ago, but it's like I want to say it was like less than 10% or something like that. I don't know. It was funny. I actually had a tweet kind of along these lines. Yeah, I think it was for high school. I don't know. I could be totally wrong. But yeah, I actually had a tweet about this because like I know that in Bitcoin world, I see tweets all the time talking about how they want to homeschool their kids and whatnot. In my tweet, I was just like, I mean, my kids definitely aren't going to be homeschooled. I think like the benefits of like being involved in school, forming social hierarchies, like as a social hierarchy, probably much better life skills than like what you learn in terms of like history, and if you learn a lot more early on or not. Like that's one of the big trade-offs. But yeah, I mean, like my biggest, I'm not against like, I don't know. I dated this girl one time who was in like the IB program, or whatever school. And it's technically like that's like a public program, and like all the kids I know who went to the best colleges weren't kids who went to private schools. They went into like IB programs at public schools, and so it's like, yeah, that might be pretty ideal. And I think also in terms of areas like that, I don't even know how much the indoctrination exists, just as those programs, they are so busy actually learning, things that are valuable, that I feel like they're not pushing nearly as much crap. But like, I don't really know. Anywho, yeah, I probably don't want kids in public school though. It's going to be a crazy world in like 20 years of what they're being taught. Unless we have our, Bitcoin takes over, then who knows what public schools could be like.
P, I know you guys have a bun in the oven as well. So are you guys planning to send the?
This is news to me.
Oh, surprise!
I can't imagine. I mean, I haven't looked into public school systems these days. I don't know. It's hard for me to imagine that they are up to the standards that I would have. So probably not. But I do think the socialization aspect of public schools is important. But I want to bring this back to Bitcoin, and I'm curious, Eric. We start the show off with news and notes every day, and I don't know if you were listening earlier, but I'm curious what news that has come out in the Bitcoin space has caught your attention the most. Like, what are you the most invested in terms of dominant Bitcoin news stories right now?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily like news stories, but I've been spending a lot of time over the past, pretty much since the summer, is just reading into, how I think like your Bitcoin, quote unquote banking systems will build out. So I actually released a research piece in, what was that? And, there's a lot of discussion. Well, I guess to start it, it was kind of back in July that I started digging into this research, and I think the next big step in, what I'm going to be focusing on. But, a lot of people put together like, here's how Bitcoin works, here's title implications, all that. There's not much information out there around how is this ecosystem actually going to build? Because Bitcoin can't do everything. Bitcoin can be a bear for everything. But in terms of all that functionality, we need an entire financial system that's going to reemerge in this area. And I think that that's going to be very fundamentally different from what we're familiar with historically. And, I was kind of researching the practical side of it and being like, okay, what companies exist? How do they function? How does the Lightning Network work? How is that going to create different financial markets that exist on top of Bitcoin? And then, when I was getting into that and I was kind of like picking around on Twitter and seeing what people are saying, there was a lot of, there's a lot of debate still, and there should be because it's very theoretical, but there's a lot of debate around just like the general theory of, what does credit look like on Bitcoin? Will it even exist? If it exists, what will it look like? Will there be fractional reserves? All these different types of things. And, I think there was a piece Nick Carter released this summer, and then Stefan Livera had kind of a response to it. And they're kind of more higher level discussions around credit. And I think from a lot of the public forum that was happening, there was, how do I say, people didn't have a very complete understanding. So like what I released in September was kind of discussion of that and saying like, here's what I think a full reserve system could look like. And here's what I think a fractional reserve system could also look like. And to caveat that, I'm thinking about like when I say fractional reserve, there's ways that ultimately exists. It's, within the banking model, which is something that historically we have pretty limited examples of because governments kind of control banking institutions. But this concept of free banking is something where we do have observations and we do have periods of history where we can say like, okay, there was a system where the government didn't heavily on currency issuance, and that actually just all happened through banks. And those banks decided how much gold they wanted to keep in reserves. And then they lent beyond those amounts and some failed. Like, in my book, I talked to them where eventually we had a central bank, and that creates this persistent incentive for credit to continually expand until eventually the entire system crumbles. But when you look at free banking systems, the ones that were like pretty pure, which is also hard to find because they typically aren't. If it's like you imagine a situation where it's unregulated, banks are allowed to issue as much, I'll explain the term, fiduciary media. And that's any sort of, if you're a bank and you have gold, and rather than issue gold to everybody, a big innovation was to issue paper receipts on top because they're much easier to trade. So they're much more efficient for transactions. And then once you start issuing paper beyond the amount that you have in reserves, that's when you would call it fiduciary media. You're now expanding the money supply. You don't just have one-to-one backing for every paper receipt that you issue. And it was interesting is that when you look at some of these systems that were like generally free, I mean, weren't heavily regulated, even if there wasn't a central bank or anything, like the US is a good example of like an overly regulated system. There were all these laws that were still enforcing all these perverse incentives within the US free banking system. So bond collateral laws were one of the big ones. And, it was like we had all these banks that were within various states, and there was no central bank in the US. This was for about a century, maybe a little bit longer. But different states had separate regulations, and we had banks within those who were all issuing their own notes. And these states heavily regulated that and kind of forced these bond collateral laws on top of banks, where they'd say like, okay, if you guys want to issue, fiduciary media in this state, then you have to use our bonds as your collateral. And therefore, the collateral got all fucked up, and there was issues that happened too with wars going on and things like. But anyways, that system did not function well, and there were a ton of problems that emerged from that system. But what's largely looked at, one of the systems that actually functioned pretty well was the Scottish free banking system, and that was kind of like 18th, 19th century, and that was for a period of about a century. While it wasn't perfect, and there were regulations that were existing on top of it, saw a pretty well functioning system for nearly history. It was only during the Napoleonic Wars that it really had issues, and that's just because when you're in a banking system and there's a war and all the governments around the world start printing a ton of money and they start removing their gold standards, that makes it kind of very hard for you to ultimately run a functioning banking system when you have to compete at an international level with something that just freely is printing currency. And but anyways, the point is that with this ranking system, things actually function pretty well. And that was under a fractional reserve. And if you allow it to function in a market, there's natural limits that are imposed market on how much of that, quote unquote, fiduciary media, AKA credit, is extended through these banks. And if you allow the market to say, like, if there's, 100 banks that exist in an economy, and one of them gets too crazy and it ultimately fails and there is no bailout, then these systems function very differently than the moral hazard that we have that exists within our current system. And the banks will act under the assumption that when they will fail. So without getting into like all the nitty gritty and details, that's kind of like the idea around the theory where, so people need to understand that fractional reserve, while being a bad thing, it's not necessarily the devil. And there are situations where it's left up to free enterprise that it's actually functioned decently well. And then more of an ethical argument of whether or not you should be allowed to do that in the first place. Are you allowed to make a promise to people that they can redeem their notes one-to-one with you while you're actually, printing more notes than the amount of reserves that you have? And there's, Austrians will get into the ethics of the debate. It's important to have those conversations, but what I focus more on is what will we see? And what we do see is that in history, we've never had any sort of persistent full reserve that's ever emerged. We've had banks and large institution groups that have been relegated to being like a full reserve, where they're really just a custodian who is providing transaction services, but they're not providing any services with notes. We've seen that in history, but we've never really seen like a full reserve. There's never been a full reserve system in history. So that's one, is the expectation that'll emerge on Bitcoin is an exception to history. There's been two later, but there's plenty of arguments to why that's Bitcoin. And then on the other end, it's like, okay, well, it is also somewhat of an exception to history, but that's kind of emerged a lot more frequently. And then, I've been talking for a while here, but the idea is basically, I go into some of the trade-offs between how I see these things emerging and how ultimately we're likely to probably see both, I think, emerge. And I'm still digging in research around that. But when you look at the problems that Bitcoin solves, themselves, and then big Lightning Network and Bitcoin enabled by, on-chain asset issuance. I see the ability of having economically viable full reserve institution emerge at scale, a probable event. It doesn't mean that there won't be any sort of fractional reserve emerge, but when you look at all these different efficiencies within the system, how much information transparency we now have that was never had before in banking, the possibility of full reserves. But anyways, I'm kind of digging into a lot of areas around that, and I think the news that's relevant to that is, taro that was announced back in March this year, and Reese deployed their testnet. I think that'll be a big step for how asset issuance ultimately in Bitcoin. And then, I'm digging into like
So, or
how some of these
what
structures
aspect
are
of
going
that?
to work. And
I was just saying, can you go into
so it's
how
like Taro
might affect that?
Yeah, totally. So the big question is, like, within this digitally native ecosystem, how will we see the concept of a note ultimately emerge, and why? Because if we can transact Bitcoin with Lightning, that is a very efficient way of directly transferring. So, like, this antiquated concept of needing reserves and then have more efficient form of notes that exists on top of it, that's kind of an antiquated concept when it's like, well, we can actually just have physical settlement across Lightning, or physical settlement across Lightning. So why would any sort of institution need to issue a note? And I think one of the big key aspects of that right now is, if you look at Fediment, it's because Fediment is something that allows you, by depositing at a mint and receiving their quote unquote notes, or tokens, that will enable you to have privacy. That's one way notes will get issued, is because people are going to want the privacy benefit. And then, if people also want to have, various asset issuance that occur through something like Taro, and, Taro stable coins are just something that I think is kind of like a bridge to but if we have forms of asset issuance that are directly on chain, they can be backed by Bitcoin. And haven't fleshed out exactly how I think that'll emerge. The idea is that we're going to have these like tokens or notes that really emerge in some form. If they are emerging, then that means there's going to be institutions who ultimately create more notes than the amount of Bitcoin that ultimately backs those notes in some form. And just how all that's going to play out and what incentives they have back that, I think, is a really important question that needs to be answered. And so, like, one thing that I think is a strong argument against the idea that fractional reserve institutions will be able to exist if it was a purely Bitcoin native ecosystem is this concept of like flash loans, because very efficient way leveraging capital through these pools that we'll see in like the Defi. I think when that concept is on Bitcoin, we're effectively going to have people there and they're going to say, okay, we have proof of reserves. So we have this way of looking. If you have like a Bitcoin bank.
Can you define what a flash loan? It sounds like there's a slight delay between what I'm saying and what you can hear, but can you define for the audience what a flash loan is and how it relates to what you're talking about?
Yeah, totally. So the idea is basically like, it's an innovative concept that came out of DeFi that, like, because we have everything operating within one payment layer, we can make these instantaneous loans where if you have an arbitrage opportunity, which audience is familiar with, but it's just like a riskless transaction. If you have a way where you risklessly make a profit, then you could actually get a loan that immediately does a transaction. So I'll explain it by way of example. Think about if there was some sort of like digital Bitcoin bank, and they issued notes. We'll call them, fractional bank tokens. And tokens, the bank says, are backed 1-to-1 with Bitcoin. And you can go and you can look and you can see their account on the blockchain, and you can say, okay, they have 100 Bitcoin in their reserves. And the question becomes, what about the liabilities? How do we know that all of these other notes exist? And we could look at maybe perhaps they're like a side chain, and perhaps we could verify that. But there's going to be a lot of banks where just because they have digitally native liabilities doesn't mean that there aren't off-chain liabilities that they might have that you don't know about. So there's going to be ways like they could extend credit to somebody in some form, and then that once they extend that credit, it's like, oh, they have a liability. It's not on chain, so we don't know. And we're going to need auditors for things like that. So that's going to be a big piece around how the ecosystem builds out is having that form of audit existing. But anyways, so if you have a bank and you're like looking at it, you're like, okay, you know, they're saying that they're backed, but I don't think they're backed. So I am a big hedge fund and I'm going to speculate that they're not backed. I heard some rumblings. I have, you know, I've got 10 Bitcoins in capital that I use. What I'm going to do is because for me to, I know that they have 100 Bitcoins in reserves. So what I could do is I could buy up 100 Bitcoin worth of their notes. Now I only have 10 Bitcoins, so I can't afford to get all those Bitcoins. So I'm going to need leverage. I'm going to need to borrow money to do this. What I could go do is I could take a flash loan and I could say, the flash loan would say, okay, they have this amount of Bitcoin in reserves. We'll give you a loan for that amount because we know the second you get their tokens and you go to the bank and you go redeem those tokens for the total amount of reserves that they have, the flash loan gets immediately paid back. So because they can verifiably know that you can immediately return that liquidity through the loan, they'll allow it to happen. So what you could do is you could take that arbitrage opportunity, immediately redeem it, pay off the flash loan, and then whatever extra capital you have, you can use that to continue to redeem their tokens at the bank and see if you can push them into bankruptcy. So like hedge funds would probably take a short position and then do something like this.
Interesting.
So that would make it a very efficient way to speculate on whether or not somebody's fully backed. And then that kind of draws the question, well, are we even going to have fractional reserve institutions if we can so efficiently scale leverage to ultimately redeem against a fractional reserve? There's going to be a lot of guys who want to profit off of that, and will it even be able to exist because of that? So there's a lot more that gets complicated around that, but that's kind of like a general idea.
Wow, that seems like a huge threat to the existing system. Do you see that? Like, how do you see that playing out in the short term? Or is that something that only plays out in the medium or much longer term?
I think it's much longer. I mean, we need to have, number one, we need these institutions to exist in like a purely digitally native way for that to even happen. You know, right now we saw how the unbacked liabilities of a lot of these CeFi crypto institutions went. But it needs to be like purely digitally native for like, you know, that example that I'm talking about to work. So it's kind of like if we have some, you know, the concept of like Fediment, for example, and then it's an open protocol. People can go in, they can utilize it to create like a federation. And the question is will certain companies set up banks that are ultimately issuing more notes than the actual Bitcoin that gets sent to them through their protocols? And the trade-off to all this is, and here's the huge theoretical debate, and this is what I love about what's happening right now, is as all these things emerge, say, you know, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, as all these things emerge, we're going to have like practical examples to answer some very, very big, important economic questions that have been the subject of debate for, you know, centuries. And we're going to say like, okay, if we do have these very efficient mechanisms, is the idea that, you know, the like the Keynesian idea that like credit and having you know, the expansion of credit in a form of more elastic money versus inelastic money, is that something that actually is true? How is it going to look if we have a perfectly inelastic form of money? Will institutions need to emerge that make our money more elastic by issuing that concept of fiduciary media that creates monetary elasticity? And I'll describe that. So like if we have assume an economy that is in, you know, we'll just, there's an economy and they have some sort of major crisis that occurs, not due to anything financial, purely a natural disaster. So like they have, you know, some huge hurricane come in, a bunch of their oil refineries are set up on that coast, has this huge destruction of that capital base. Now there's this huge economic shock that occurs because there's a major supply shortage of refined oil. If we have like an economy like that, then the question becomes, if we have a perfectly inelastic form of money, what does that mean? Well, we need to build a bunch of new refineries, and we need to do that quickly. And there's going to be effectively like a form of like financial price gouging that you could argue would occur. It's just like interest rates would spike because now the demand for credit to build out this very important necessity within the world would cause this economic shock. So like the problem that critics have of inelastic money is that it doesn't respond well to economic shocks. And that's the purpose of credit, where people can say like, okay, well, rather than, actually getting that Bitcoin for if this economy runs on Bitcoin, then rather than getting that Bitcoin directly, we'll just have people all these oil refiners, they can just take on a ton of credit. That'll help them build things back up. They can weather the storm, and then they can pay that off with their future earnings. And the idea is that like credit provides that elasticity to an economy. Now, does that need to come directly through a monetary issuance? Because credit doesn't have to be
it doesn't seem like
our money.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a lot of ways that could come, but technically within a banking system, the issuance of credit directly is a little bit harder than the issuance of fiduciary media. So that's kind of the distinction on, does it need to be a part of our money, or does it just need to be credit that's issued directly? And I'll say like the difference, a good way to think about it is, when you're a company and you want to raise stock, it's much easier when you already have that stock issued and you just can take some shares out of your treasury and float them into the market versus doing an IPO. IPO takes a lot longer. So it's a similar concept. If you were to have private credit respond in that situation, it's harder to extend private credit as opposed to just banks could immediately issue fiduciary media and they could help them weather that storm very rapidly. So it's a little bit more efficient. And that's, whether or not that actually is just trivial, I'm not really certain of yet.
Yeah.
But that's that's kind of the trade-off.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I mean, the other side of that, of course, is the idea that is put forward by a lot of Bitcoiners that, when you have the ability to create free flowing credit, people tend to do so. And then, that creates these sort of skewed or distorted markets. Or do you see that as a different issue entirely?
Yeah, no, totally. Price distortions. If we're operating based off of prices, that's the most perfect form of information we can have. When we distort the money supply, then we're impacting that. And that's, a major argument against having credit issuance be a part of the money supply. But it is true that credit itself affects pricing mechanisms regardless of whether or not it's a part of the money supply. And I think that with the trade-off is there's ideas of what a perfect market looks like, and there's the trade-off that we'll have to say is like, okay, do we have perfect pricing information, or is credit something that people actually want to use? And it's not really about whether or not you theoretically think it is. It's the fact that it emerges in the market and the fact that the market can choose. And like, that's kind of on that point, that's kind of where I come out on all these debates is like, I'm more trying to concern myself of what I think will emerge and what practical considerations will exist to allow that to emerge rather than what's, theoretically ideal, just because what we'll see, I believe what's more important is freedom of choice above everything else. Now, I can have a hardline Austrian stance and I can say, like we need to set hard limits. And some of the major Austrian thinkers, I think, really had to backpedal on this one, because what we do notice is that, to your point earlier, we do have credit that emerges through the form of like fiduciary media throughout history. And like, Mises, for example, he was a proponent of saying, we should probably have that outlawed. And there should be some sort of regulatory standards. Now, it's not quite that terse because within the context of what he's saying, it was in a specific scenario. But I think that nonetheless, the point remains, Austrians were aware that these things don't emerge privately. So therefore, the solution is violence to prevent it from emerging, which I don't really follow on that line of logic. That's not something that I'm a proponent of. I think that if the people want fractional reserve, give them, let them do whatever the fuck they want. I'm going to opt into a full reserve bank. And that's the whole point, is that I think it's much better to allow freedom of choice and for there to be consequences of that freedom of choice than to allow people to control it with violence. So it's really more of a question of government at that point.
It's so interesting.
So,
when you
wait,
put it
I have a question. What theoretically, like, and I'm not talking the literal difference, but what is the difference between a fractional reserve bank, a full reserve bank, and then like one of these ridiculous Ponzi's that we see pop up that offer you yields like a Celsius versus then like a self custody platform?
Hey, sorry, can you repeat that? You broke out.
What is the difference between like a fractional reserve bank, a full reserve bank, and then a custody service like a Celsius that'll offer you higher yields by using Celsius, i.e., fractional reserve bank, versus like a no yield type of bank or wallet service like a Strike, for example, or Strike to Moon Wallet, for example, full reserve?
Yeah. So like, I think that, so with Celsius, they are, and I know bits and pieces about the situation. I don't like have a holistic view on all of it, but they weren't operating necessarily as a bank in terms of like the economics of what they were doing. They were obviously taking on credit and risks that they could not repay. And in a sense, that's kind of like, quote unquote fractional reserve, but it's really like, I think those terms are kind of more reserved for a specific scenario where we actually do have banking light note issuance. But anyway, it's like any company can take on too much credit and then can also ultimately take that capital that they just borrowed and then they invest it in assets that are productive or assets that provide a rate of return if they're financial assets. And that may not work out and they have a fixed liability that they have to repay. And then they ultimately fail. So I'd say, it's kind of more in line with that, but I don't know enough details to really say like, I think that there was a bit of both going on in terms of how they were running their entire system. But, certainly with the way that the promises they were making and how they had things set up, it was, it was like fraudulent in a lot of ways. And, what was interesting is how, I remember one of my friends who emailed me who had money in Voyager was saying that they were providing some sort of promise that they had like FDIC insurance and that was actually like on their website at one point for people and that it subsequently was removed, which like, that's just pure fraud. If there's anything that surprised me more this year, it's the level of risk that these guys took on. I was blown away at how stupid it was and how I just couldn't imagine if I was in their shoes and I had, literally won the lottery. I'm in this industry where I just capitalized $1 billion business within a matter of years. Like you're set for life. Like why take risk? Why not just pare back down? Why not, take some money off the table? But like the stupidity of some of these guys, even just from their own self-interest, it was so short term. Yeah, the hubris. I couldn't even believe it.
We were talking earlier about how what was his title? He was the head of policy and regulatory affairs at Celsius earlier this year. Just got hired by JP Morgan Chase to head their digital assets regulatory policy division.
Yeah, I saw that announcement. And yeah, to be expected. Like that.
Wait, how so? I mean, that's like, I was just railing against it. I mean, it seems insane.
Well, I mean, if I was in his shoes, well, I insane in terms of like, you mean, the fact that he would go to JP Morgan or
no, the fact that they would hire him, like he basically oversaw this regulatory environment or this regulatory policies at Celsius that, where Celsius did terribly. Although I guess the flip side of that is he managed to navigate it and no one's gone to jail. So maybe that's why they hired him.
Right. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, exactly. I don't know enough details around like the civil and like criminal penalties that are going to emerge out of all of it. But yeah, I'd say like, I mean, I guess more from JP Morgan's perspective, it's kind of like, well, who even has experience doing this? It's like, oh, well, the guy who grew a big company and fucked it up does, and he's looking for a job. It's probably more along those lines. It's like there's this kind of like limited experience within these ecosystems. But yeah, I completely agree. I think it's pretty funny that they would hire somebody with that amount of, you know, tarnishment to their brand.
Interesting. So, Q, a second ago, it looked like you were about to say something, and then I cut you off. No? Okay. I'm wondering, do you have any thoughts about the announcement out of Dorsey's Bluesky initiative, the AT protocol, federated social networking?
Oh, yeah, that's something I don't have any thoughts yet. I want to read into it more. I think it's interesting. This is one of the big problems that, yeah, because I just retweeted that actually, because I really think that people need to dig into that. And I think that Dorsey's probably, you know, very well aligned to be the guy that pulls it off. But this idea of the decentralized social network, if that gets solved, wow, we just solved a ton of problems in the world. And yeah, I just want to dig into the technicalities of it. I mean, like the key thing is, I think the key constraint is basically will it actually work with consumer adoption that a very small price to pay is worth it for autonomy and ownership of data, and will that actually work for consumer demand, which I think is something that people within the Bitcoin space kind of overestimate, because we are that demographic of people who is ready to do that. But you know, you have to wonder whether or not all the sheep and the followers are ultimately going to be interested in doing something like that one day. But yeah, it's kind of like there's this conflict of interest that exists within current social media between the publishers and the advertisers and the platform. And if we can solve that conflict of interest through decentralization, which ultimately means somebody has to pay for something, is it worth it? And I think a lot of it's solved from the idea of, will you pay to watch somebody, to get access to somebody else tweeting? Will you do the, you know, will this podcasting 2.0 trend really get to the scale where this can be a large scale thing? Yeah, it's just a question of, will people pay for it? And if they can make the user experience enough, the profitability for content creators high enough, and, you know, ultimately the quality of content great enough that people will pay small amounts to have it in small proportions. And it can be a small enough amount of like their personal budgets. You know, if social media costs you 1% of your income a year or something, and you get a lot of value out of that, it could be interesting. But when their trade-off is free for advertisements and for, you know, whatever they're being shilled, and for lack of privacy and all that, then I don't know. It's just like, I don't have a lot of faith in people, and that's what concerns me. But we'll see.
Yeah, I share your concerns. I also do not have very much faith in people. And one of the patterns that, you know, before I was, you know, full-time Bitcoin, I was in the software engineering space. And one of the things that I have seen again and again and again, and I think it will, or I worry that it will play out here as well, is not necessarily with Bluesky, but on the axis of like, will people be willing to pay for a thing that creates a better user experience versus, you know, accept just having you know, ads force fed down their you know, sensory systems. There's this pattern where there'll be an app that comes out, or a service. You can take your pick, you know, Reddit, Hulu, whatever else, Twitter even, that will be really, really compelling. And then either because the people that were originally behind the app step out, or for other reasons, for financial reasons, something that was really amazing, an incredible information source, then gets kind of perverted almost. And it can happen slowly or very rapidly, where suddenly advertisers and monetization becomes the focus. And then the quality of the systems just degrades very, very rapidly. And I feel like that just happens again and again and again. And to your point, I think it's because people are willing to accept these ads. And I've never really understood it. I'm a very distractible person. And so I hate seeing ads. Yeah, I know, right? It makes me so angry when I have to like, you know, go through Twitter and I have to like scroll past all these promoted tweets, but I guess most people don't seem to, or they don't think they mind very much. I don't really know where I'm going with this other than to just say that I agree that people don't seem to track on the value of having a, ad-free or non-monetized experience as much as I would expect them to.
Right. Yeah. And I think one thing that'll also probably solve it too, which I think is interesting about Elon's idea with, X company after he buys Twitter. The more holistic your social media experience becomes, it's probably easier to get people to put income into it. It's kind of like, everybody's paying what for a Netflix subscription every single year. And it's just like your social media to you is probably, for most people, way more valuable than that. And people would probably be willing to pay a lot more. And if there's a way to holistically combine it into something where it's just like, oh, I don't have to, do all this like individual payments for, individual things that I'm subscribing to. Maybe there's a way where I can do it at like a kind of like a, I don't know, like package level or something that could be something that simplifies the decision making for the consumer and might make it something that's a lot simpler. Like, oh, I pay $15 a month and, I get everything else that comes with that. And that might be a bit more valuable. I don't really know though, but I think that, I think that this will be like so incredibly important, and the way that it's going to change information and politics if it's achieved, and ultimately the way information is disseminated will be one of the coolest experiments in history. I mean, what information is going to rise to the top if we did have a truly decentralized social media platform, and what's going to persist? And will these arguments that like misinformation is a natural, kind of like tragedy of the commons that emerges within social environments, and we need watchmen to protect us from that, will that be true? We'll find out if that emerges.
Well said.
I'm curious, Eric, if you feel as though there's a degree of, like, yes, I understand and I hear this case of people don't want ads, and that ad experience diminishes the overall experience of just accessing the internet. Maybe I'm just a cheap piece of shit, but like when it comes to social media in particular, it's the fact that it is free. Like if I were to have to pay for that, do you not feel that that's a level of friction that could in turn actually decrease overall social media usage? Or is it just so ingrained in our society and culture today that like we're not gonna shake social media, even if we were to just add, like the same way a drug dealer will just like get you on the hook, give you a free sample at first, and then like,
Well,
then
wait,
they got
hold
you.
on. I also want to
Like,
be clear.
we got the free sample version. We got the Facebooks, the Twitters, the
Yep.
Instagrams, TikToks. We got the free version. But now you want to hang out with like your friends still? Like you got to show.
Well, no,
it's just it's $1 a month, and then before you know it, like when it's our kids, it's like we're paying $100 a month for them to have access to social media. Like Eric, our kids are just screwed. Is the point I'm trying to make?
No, wait. I also want to be clear. Sorry, Eric, before you jump in. Having ads or promoted content in media streams, like that's a reality of life, right? You have to be able to figure out some way to fund whatever service you're providing. That's just how it works. In order to have a team, or the resources, they have to come from somewhere, essentially. But I think that there are ways to do that are, if not elegant, like aren't egregious. And then I think that there are ways of doing that where it becomes super egregious. And it's really hard to strike that balance, but it can be done. So I'm not saying that there should be no ads or no way of creating revenue streams for services and systems that cost money to operate and require content creators to produce. But I think that in many situations it becomes really egregious. So.
Yeah. And I agree. I think that, I guess I kind of glossed over a lot of this, but it's like, we could have these ecosystems emerge and there's, ads. It's just more like centralization, centralization provides efficiencies in a lot of ways. So like if we remove the centralization from the system, then that means that we're going to be creating redundancy of the system in some form. All those servers, all those decisions made at Facebook, all the software development, all those things that happen, that is pushed to the ultimate content creators in some form if we had a decentralized system, which ultimately are passing along those costs to the consumer in some form. And that's kind of the idea, is that we've created some sort of redundancy. It's going to be a relatively less inefficient system, but it's going to be much more free. And will people ultimately want, that means it would have to get to a scale that's large enough to ultimately be competitive with the incumbent, Web 2 type system. And that's the key distinction here is, yeah, well, I mean, we'll have ads, but if I'm an advertiser, and I'm going to go into like this system, I'm going to talk to some guy who is a, content creator on the, Bluesky platform, and, his costs are much higher. So he's looking for sponsors to do X, Y, and Z. Well, are the users going to be there where they even give a shit? Because if they don't give a shit, they're not going to move, in which case the economic model might not make sense. So like, and how would that adoption ultimately be driven to get it to a scale to where these economic models make sense? And we do get the advertisement dollars that start to move into like a new decentralized social media platform. I don't know. I feel like there needs to be some sort of like major crux that gets figured out that will ultimately make people make that shift. And I don't think that that's likely to come from people hating the government a ton. Maybe it is, but that, we've seen all these things happen and we never see the adoption shift. We've seen all the other Twitters that have emerged, and we've seen like the Conservative Party try to bootstrap those, which is, a pretty powerful organization that's trying to do that. And we just never really saw that adoption come to fruition. So it's kind of like, maybe there has to be some sort of missing piece that gets figured out with this new solution that really makes that adoption and the changes shift. And I don't really know what that will be.
That's fair. I really think our society would be far more developed if we just stuck to MySpace. Like an entire generation would have learned to code. And we probably would, like all of us would have stumbled across Bitcoin that much sooner. Because if Tom from MySpace figured out Bitcoin, he would have told all of his friends. And Tom was always one of my friends on MySpace. So therefore, I would have learned about Bitcoin that much sooner. See, Pete, everything's about Bitcoin. Eric, I want to now talk to you about, probably the most talked about person just overall, not only in Bitcoin land, but in normie land. And that is EA. What are your thoughts? Like what was your initial thought when you heard the news that JP Morgan, which allowed Jeffrey Epstein to stay banked with them for 5 years after he was convicted, decided to throw out Kanye West and his, I believe it was, Chris, correct me if I'm wrong on this, I think it was only $170 million in the account, or 240 million, something in that range, something between 100 and 240 million dollars. They just said, no, you can't bank with us because you're 120 million.
Yeah. Look, I mean, Ye's being marginalized. And I don't know. I think like, yeah, I mean, he's seeing the power of it. He's connected to all these people who are kind of on the cusp of this Bitcoin movement. I think he's obviously going to become a part of it at some point, which I'm pretty psyched about. I mean, it'd be so badass if like Ye ended up making an announcement that he bought a huge dip. And he's like, I own, like 100 Bitcoins now, or whatever he does. But I see something like that potentially coming, particularly with the people that he's friends with. I hope that he's smart enough to not get caught up in all the other bullshit, and he sees like the real value, especially because he just had a significant amount of wealth, kicked out of his bank, and he sees that censorship, and that'll ultimately guide him towards Bitcoin, because that's with my other guy Mike, that's been one of the big issues, is he's Mike.Soul or whatever on Twitter, and And, it's tough. I wish that wasn't the case, but we'll see if he comes around. I think Mike's smart enough to get there too at some point, but, we're going to have to start some sort of movement to get Mike Tyson into it, get him to read my book. And one of my goals, I would love to have him or Kanye write a foreword to my book in a revised edition at some point. That would be just the shit. But, and I'd let them write whatever they want because they'd say a bunch of crazy shit. And I'd just be like, yeah, like, let's put it in print. That would be the right thing to do. But,
you'll be like, I'm a patriot. And so, of course, unedited. Let's go.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the pitch would just be like, okay, so here's the thing on Mike and Kanye in the book. Number one, I mean, the reason the idea emerged was like when I was kind of like tying out all the chapters and it was getting close to finish. I was like, oh, like I forgot to put quotes at the beginning of all the chapters. And like, that's, something people do. So I was like, what quotes do I want to put? And I was like, I like at first I was thinking like, oh, I could do like these economists or something. And I was like, oh, that's kind of fucking stupid. I don't want to do that. And I was just like, who are my favorite, most quotable people? And I was like, Mike and Kanye. And that's kind of how I started at it. But the reason I like felt comfortable doing it was I think that like they're very unique people who have been blatantly honest and obviously say dumb things or have done dumb things. And I think this whole like people who have, view the quotes of some people versus other people based on some premise of like moral relativism. People have a hard time saying like, if somebody's ever done something that's like bad in their lives and they're famously known for it, people have a very hard time like distinguishing the good they've done. And that's what I liked about these guys is like, you have a guy like Mike who at an incredibly young age went from like literally living in poverty to becoming one of the top athletes in the world, like literally rise to being the best in the world at what he did. And he didn't give a fuck about anything the whole time. He was honest. He wasn't like going into the media trying to portray himself in a certain way. He was honest through and through throughout everything to the point where like, I mean, he literally just trolled the media for a period of his life with it. And I respect the shit out of that. I really like people that are that honest. And that was another thing with Kanye. I was like, yeah, Kanye said a bunch of like crazy shit. I have no idea what the fuck he's talking about. He's also said some really smart shit that's like brutally honest that literally no other rapper would ever say publicly. And like, that's something I respected about him too. And that's what I like about what he's doing. And like, yeah, it's just like maybe Kanye, maybe you don't have to take a stab at the Jews when you're trying to make a point. Maybe it would probably go better for you if you didn't do that. But I mean, he's legitimately saying what he thinks. And like, and I respect people who legitimately say what they think. So like that's kind of the rationale behind all of it.
Interesting.
Top 5 favorite Kanye songs.
Oh shit. Number 1, I got to go with Gorgeous. But okay. So have you ever seen the My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy short film?
Of course.
Oh yeah. So I'll probably watch that once a year. But like, honestly, that was my, yeah, I've never had to answer this before but that honestly might be my favorite album of his. And, oh, you know what? I actually take it back. Gorgeous isn't my number 1. Drive Slow is my number 1.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm a big Drive Slow fan. I've been listening to that like most of my life, I think. But all right, Ultralight Beam. I'm a huge fan of that song. And all right, what do I got? I got 2 more.
Choose carefully.
I know this is important. Through the Wire is cool. And what's badass is like what that song's about when he was like finishing the album after he like got his jaw broken and his jaw was had a bunch of wires in it and he was strapped up and he finished it all. So like that's the point of the song is like I spit it through the wire and he was just like I'm gonna finish this thing after he got all fucked up from a car wreck, which is pretty cool. Yeah, that's a good one. Oh, and then Everything I Am. That's probably above Through the Wire. Yeah.
Okay. Excellent list.
I've got another Bitcoin question for you. Oh, also,
But it
I
has to
guess-
be related to Kanye West.
Oh, it's not.
Yeah.
It's
No,
not.
then-
although,
then-
do you want to tell the people about the hat that they can buy, the incredibly important, deeply Bitcoin related hat they can buy from our?
I absolutely do. I bought both colors this morning when I saw that. I was like,
Nice.
"Fuck yeah,
Let's
a
go."
Great idea. Great idea. I bet that
There's-
you guys sell a ton of those.
There's
Love
a hat
that.
you can get from our store, our meme store, which is Kanye West's Satoshi Nakamoto hat, or a derivation thereof.
Use promo code BM Live so you don't have to pay full price the way Eric did.
Fuck, man. I should have waited
Sorry,
2
Eric.
hours. The second I saw it, I just smash by.
It's fine. You have royalties coming in, so you're good.
So I want to ask you, you have published a number of articles on Bitcoin Magazine, which for those who may not have read them, I highly encourage you to do so. As you can tell from this conversation, Eric is extremely eloquent and just as good of a writer as he is a wordsmith. A speaking wordsmith. These are words that make sense. Don't worry about it. My question to you, Eric, is you've written a lot about sort of trying to educate people about sort of some of the fundamental aspects of Bitcoin from a technical perspective, from a financial perspective. Other than your own writings, because you can't say those, what are some of your favorite resources that you direct people to around Bitcoin when you're trying to get them into it?
Yeah, so I've actually got on my website, which is just like linked on my Twitter. But if you go to my website, I have a tab resources, and I have some things listed. There's in terms of like Bitcoin only, because I cover Bitcoin, economics, finance, and then like kind of got some miscellaneous stuff I like in there too. But I'd say that like the majority of my monitoring is kind of like world events. In terms of like what I'm following for like Bitcoin only content, obviously Bitcoin Mag, but in terms of like thinkers, I guess is probably better because I get most of that from Twitter. Alan Farrington and I are working on some research together right now. Alan is just a very clear thinker, and I'm a huge fan of the work that he does, and I'd recommend anybody to read the things that he says.
You should get the Kanye West hat and Alan Farrington's book, Bitcoin is Venice, at the Bitcoin Magazine store.
Yeah, and my book too. But I think I don't know. I'm trying to think of who else. It's funny because like I'm so scrambled when I'm on Twitter. I really
That's
like
because you shitpost so much, bro.
Yeah, I know. I kind of need to like slow down with it. I'll like have my days where I just like go off on shit posting for like an hour, and I can tell like it's kind of funny because I like half of my followers are like a lot of like older guys, and like I don't think they know what the fuck I'm talking about. And I'm kind of like, all right, I need to get a little bit more better content mixed in here.
Never change.
Strong disagree. You got to keep people on their toes, mentally, physically. Otherwise, what are we doing here? But I also love Alan Farrington. He participated in 2 of the panels at Bitcoin Amsterdam, which were fantastic. I think both of them are up now. Yeah, they are. Both of them are up now on our YouTube. There's a playlist for those who would like to check them out on our Bitcoin Magazine YouTube, titled Bitcoin Amsterdam, and Alan Farrington his talks are there.
Also, really quickly, Eric, one last thing for the audience. Rumble, it's up there. Please feel free to subscribe. YouTube, subscribe down below. And if you're listening to this podcast later, A, we go live on YouTube. B, you should make sure you subscribe and leave us a rating so other people can discover us. Thank you. Eric, back to you. I want to get a sense from you. We've been in the depth of a bear market now for this entire year, and yet Bitcoin and innovation around Bitcoin continues to grow. We see hash rate reaching new highs. We see difficulty readjusting and now pushing higher and higher. You mentioned updates like Taro coming through. What are some of the most exciting things about Bitcoin tech that you think is going to really be a catalyst during this next bull run? Like what is something being developed today that every new user come 2024, 2025 is going to be overly familiar with and be interacting with.
Interesting. Well, I mean, to a lot of my points earlier. Okay, so I guess here's kind of a way that I could break it down. I think that, when to the points that I was describing earlier about Taro, Fediment, how some of these technologies can create like the institutions we need to really like bring Bitcoin to the level of like global utility and scalability. I think that there's this concept of like irreducible complexity. And that's the idea. It's the first time I actually learned about it when I was reading like this book about evolution. It was actually Richard Dawkins. But it's kind of like he described like, so it's interesting. So like with a lot of arguments that are made in like religions are based on this concept of irreducible complexity. Like, okay, well, if, we didn't have a designer who created the world, then, how are eyes created? And like, how is something so complex, the process of iteration over evolution? And there's like points made to how like something like that, it would be impossible to ultimately evolve into that type of form. And like one example that I thought was really interesting, and I'm going to butcher it because I read this so long ago, but it was the frog leg, and the way that it ultimately would evolve over time is something that there couldn't, because of how what's the word, how extreme that ultimate development was. Evolutionary biologists couldn't explain gradual steps that ultimately would have led to something like a frog leg emerging. And there was like one type of frog where they found proof that these frogs they actually developed and they evolved over time, this form of like scaffolding. Similar to how like you build up scaffolding before you're building a building, and then you remove the scaffolding once the building's finally in place. It allows you to get things to the next step before you can get to completion, and then you remove it after. And there's like frog that evolved kind of with that. And the idea is like this concept of irreducible complexity is like there are certain things that I think similar in like the way that Bitcoin grows that aren't going to get to that point of full functionality and where we can really realize their full utilities without some form of scaffolding that's put in place that ultimately allows us to get there. So I think like, something that's going to be much more immediate that's emerging over the next few years. And, this may not be as relevant to like the, US community, but I think what Galloway's doing in their community banking, I think that those types of services and the open source platforms they're building out is kind of like, I think that bridge that's going to get us to ultimately this like digitally native ecosystem. And I think that, so like this vision of Bitcoin's future that's digitally native, I think is kind of like in terms of consumer adoption is irreducibly complex in a lot of forms. And we need services kind of like a Galloway and others that are emerging that can create that high utility, that bring people into the ecosystem, that'll ultimately bridge into this purely digitally native system in 20, 30 years.
Interesting. Are you intentionally leaving Fedi out of that? Or do you mean like Galloway, Fedi, everything that they're kind of...
Oh yeah. Fedi too. So I think that like Galloway is a bit more of a holistic solution in certain ways. And I think that like things can emerge on top of Fedi that'll get us there, but Galloway specifically because, Fedi is an extreme privacy solution and it's going to take a while to get there. Galloway is kind of already up and running and it doesn't have
of course.
the same
It's with
trade-offs,
Bitcoin Beach.
but
actually, can you define for the audience exactly what you mean when you say Galloway and what's happening with Bitcoin Beach and how it's been implemented?
Yeah. So like, I mean, it was kind of like, with Bitcoin Beach, it was kind of like the proof of concept for Galloway, and they went down there and they said, okay, well, if we can create this circular Bitcoin economy that's going to help these people, and then they did, and then it worked, and that was kind of their proof of concept. So now they're like expanding that idea of like community banking to all these other markets that they're looking into right now, the specifics of which I'm not totally certain of, but like a lot of these South American economies is what they're starting to build out in. And they're basically like an open source protocol, and they're providing a way for, if you want to set up a way to run like community banking within, a smaller town, or you want to be a developer and you want to build out your own community bank very quickly, They provide the tools and infrastructure that you'll need to do that. They also provide it in a hosted way where they do most of it themselves. So it allows people to, one, get in through a hosted way, and they say, okay, we really like this. This is valuable. It's working for us. And then a developer is involved, and they can build it out and actually run it based on all of their own infrastructure. So that's kind of the idea that's happening. And while that has a lot of trust trade-offs that people in the Bitcoin community are against in a lot of ways, there's 2 points to that. Number one, to the point I made earlier around like bridging to the next future. Well, these things are relevant, and the risk that people have with that is, well, does it ever become a bridge to the destination we had in mind, or do we bridge our way to a destination that's centralized and not as and permissioned that we don't want? So that's kind of one of the key risks that we'd be considering from that. But number two, if we do get to this final vision of global Bitcoin standard, there will always be institutions and people that will use centralized services or have trust-based services in some form. The question is whether or not we have enough self-sovereign people that acts as a deterrence mechanism against financialization and moral hazard that'll emerge from it, which Bitcoin enables for us to do. As long as we have services where people can be totally self-sovereign, the question becomes what percentage of assets really need to be peer-to-peer self-sovereign to be a deterrence mechanism where banks, if they're ever like, oh, we're going to take advantage of people can say, fuck you, we're going to pull our money out and go back into a peer-to-peer operating mode, which you can't do in our current system and really haven't been able to for all practical purposes throughout history. So that's the key deterrence mechanism. The question is, how big does that economy need to be? And how much functionality does it need to have so that it is a capable alternative for people who don't trust banks? And then, so like that's yeah, anyways, that's what I say.
So what else? What else has got you excited, or provokes anxiety? What do you think the largest attack vector is? The most significant attack vector is right now in Bitcoin?
Yeah, and I think it was. I remember I got asked this question a year ago, and it's interesting how it is starting to kind of come to fruition a bit. But it was always the bait and switch strategy by institutions. That was definitely the easiest one. And I think that
what do you mean by that?
So like by governments that are ultimately getting involved in like, will CBDCs be something that gets issued through Ethereum? And that's definitely one of the biggest attacks, and like Bitcoin's designed to be resistant to it. But how will financial institutions comply? How much Bitcoin will people own that is not real Bitcoin and is part of a government compatible wallet that also issues a CBDC? And we slowly and gradually just get pushed through the ecosystem into this anything but Bitcoin type environment. It was Ben why can't I think of his name of Epsilon Theory? Ben
Hunt.
Yeah, Ben Hunt, with his Bitcoin TM article that he wrote. I think that was about a year and a half ago. I think everybody should go read that. I think he's a great thinker. Just search Bitcoin TM exclamation
even
mark.
With all of his nonsense around like green coin or leaf coin or whatever.
Oh, I guess I haven't even seen that. I know. Well, tell me about it.
He just went off the deep end. He basically, he for a long time was kind of like, I think that, quote unquote, blockchain technology is really interesting. I'm just not sure it's Bitcoin. And then finally, during the peak of the bull market, he was like, I've got the solution. I think it's called like plant coin. And the whole thing is like proof of plant. It's just like a ridiculous shit coin that like has no basis in reality. It was just, I personally was extremely disappointed because like you, I have thought of him as an overly wordy, but ultimately, good thinker, and you should just go check out the shitcoin he tried to launch during the bull market.
Yeah, I think that'll be another interesting area that I think emerges in shitcoin universe that I actually think will be something that draws quite a bit of capital to it. I bet carbon credits are going to start getting monetized on Ethereum in some form. I bet we're going to see that. And it's going to be, it's because it actually makes a lot of sense because that market's very fucked up in the traditional world. There's all these disparate markets of issuance, and they're not as fungible. And it's kind of like OTC, and it's very inefficient. There's fraud that exists. I bet that some of that's going to start getting tokenized on Ethereum, and that's going to be like some huge, big narrative for the Ethereum platform and it being green. And ultimately, it will attract a lot of capital and value. And there's a lot of people that want to brand themselves, particularly major corporations, around that narrative. I definitely see that as something being a big catalyst to Ethereum in the near future.
But
interesting.
Like, couldn't you make a case saying that their merge to proof of stake was an attempt in doing exactly that, and that has, at least by today's standards, seems to have fallen flat and been just a whole nothing burger?
Oh yeah, I agree. I think the distinction is that there is a large market for carbon credits that is very inefficient right now, and there's all these problems that are from it. And, obviously it is the polar opposite of anything Bitcoin. It is a cooperative agreement by governments of, forced taxation in a new form that's being globally instrumented. And all of that is true, but it is a very large market because of coercion. And I think that is value that can be moved, that once people start trading carbon credits on Ethereum in some form, that's going to be a lot of value that gets attracted, because there is an opportunity to make that a lot more efficient, and that actually would solve some problems for the market. And I think that that's something that we'll probably see in the near future, and that's going to be like the next step in why they're green. And look at what we're doing for the carbon credits in the Paris Accord.
Cool. So I just want to make sure we have this quote ready for Bitcoin Twitter. It says here, Eric Yakes believes that the future of carbon credits will be on Ethereum, and it will send ETH to the moon. Is that the right
Please,
quote?
God, no.
Oh,
Please,
fuck
God,
that noise.
No.
Yeah, that's.
No, and my point in saying that, let me be clear, because I didn't really speak to the other side of it. My point in saying that is like, because now I sound like a fucking piece of shit. But
so your words, not mine.
My point in saying that is just for like people to be aware of the narratives that I think are going to emerge, and like ultimately, I think it's probably going to continue developing that direction. We're going to continue to see that division, and then all the same criticisms that Bitcoiners have always had of Ethereum still remain. And yeah, but just be prepared for that. I bet that happens.
So to be perfectly clear, you are in fact shitting on Ethereum and you hate ESG.
Yeah, I think I'm not like, I hate ESG. It's funny because it's something that eventually I have to at some point since I've been involved in Bitcoin. It was the environmental climate change narrative was something I always ignored, just because whenever there's like a highly politicized topic, I tend to kind of ignore it because it's all bullshit information that creates division between two sides typically, unless you really want to spend the time to get deep. And I just didn't really care. And then now that I'm in this, like, it comes up so much that I was like, I never like fully got my head around what I think about climate change. But I think that like, there's changes, we can witness changes occurring. The question is, how do we determine causality? And then how do we infringe on property rights based on how we determine that causality? And I haven't like done all the digging to like really where I come out on that. But the idea of like globally, like this idea of ESG is just controlling resources at a global level, allowing governments to cooperate in a way to do that. It's just incremental tax revenue that they receive. And more importantly, it's coordinated, justified way to control the property of major institutions. And that's bad. That's really bad.
Well, I look forward to you finishing that report and then coming here and telling us all about it. Because as we established at the beginning of the show, P cannot read, refuses to read. So you must read him this report out loud. As
another
you
piece
have
of
read your
canon
book.
enters the tomb of P. But my friends, this has been an awesome show. Eric, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate your time. I'm sad that we did not get to see your basement. The last time you were on, you had that whiteboard, but there was like a weird quilt, like just like cruising on top of it. So I'm glad to see that you've got it more exposed now. We'll have to have you back on again when we can see you visually the entire time. But I want to remind everybody that you can use code BMLive to buy tickets to Bitcoin 2023 if you've not already. As we talked about earlier, it's going to be even more incredible than Bitcoin 2022. Also, of course, we have the print edition, which is about to become a collector's item because the new one is going to come out, the Orange Party issue, very soon. Pick one up while you still can. We're going to go to a quick commercial break, and then we will be back with Fedwatch with Ansel and CK. Stick around.
What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Fedwatch. My name is Ansel Lindner, and I am here with my co-host, CK. How are you doing, CK?
I am doing good. I'm a little under the weather, but pushing through. Excited to be here. A lot to catch up on. How you doing, Ansel?
Good, good. Yes, we did not have a show last week, of course, because of the Amsterdam conference, which I unfortunately did not get to go to. Hopefully we can hear some highlights here up front, but we have a big show. Yeah, we're going to catch up on UK updates, China updates, talk a little Bitcoin, talk a little Europe energy crisis. So lots on the plate today. But what give us a recap of your experience over there in Amsterdam, CK?
No, it was a lot of fun. Honestly, Amsterdam is just an awesome city. So honestly, it's kind of hard to mess it up. But it was a great event. You know, bear markets really bring a curated crowd, a lot less tourists. We had about 3,000 diehard Bitcoiners, the majority of them from Europe. And it was a great event. We had 3 different stages. The majority of them were standing room the entire time, which is really awesome to see. We had a few really hard-hitting panels where, you know, advocates on the ground fighting for humanitarian causes in embattled regions. They're talking about Bitcoin and how it can help them and how they've been using it. So those are the narratives I love to hear the most. Obviously tough times, but yeah, it's great to kind of just see Bitcoin being taken seriously in Europe, and obviously you and I think that that's important. So it was great times. Obviously it kind of hit me hard. It hit a bunch of people hard, everyone partying a little bit too hard, but getting a lot of attention as well. We were at the same exact time as a central bank conference too. So I got in an Uber and the guy was like, Bitcoin or central bankers, who are you working for? So obviously I said it was Bitcoin.
That's cool. So did you have, I mean, I watched a bunch of clips and there was a bunch of people talking topics around macro. Did you have any macro conversations behind the scenes with people? What are people thinking about? What's the general kind of feeling, I guess, in the Bitcoin insiders of the macro situation?
Yeah, I mean, people think that Europe is in for troubled times still. There's an enormous amount of kind of anxiety and fear about what is happening in Ukraine. Obviously, I felt a lot closer to it when it was happening. I was flying in. That's when the strikes on Kyiv on Monday happened. So it really kind of hits home how close it is to Europe. It's on the continent. But at the same time, there was a lot of excitement in the air, as if Bitcoin was the future, that we were talking about the right things, and there's this kind of defiant optimism, whereas throughout Europe right now, I think there's just a lot of fear, and people just looking on the outside looking in, they could see it.
Yeah, one thing that struck me was Bitcoin Amsterdam happening. Of course, that was the headline conference, but there was a couple other conferences going on. And I was like, man, this is like the industry, even though we're at close to the bottom, right? We're at close to the bottom and in the bear market, but there's still enough of the, I guess, liveness within the community to support all of these conferences. And I think that is super bullish, because just think back a couple years. I mean, I've been in Bitcoin for a long time, but if you think back to like 2015 bear market, there's no way there would have been enough of this, I guess, optimism out there. The holders of last resort, that there wasn't a lot of us at that time to support that type of week-long 3 different conferences. So that's one thing that I noticed big time from this bear market, is that it is just a bear market, but it's a bear market that has a lot more optimism and a lot more activity, actually.
No, absolutely. I think every single bear market has more optimism and more activity, but this time it just really shows Bitcoin's staying power. And I think that is just going to continue. It's going to get harder to bring the honey badger down. And I think that the enthusiasm amongst the community is going to just be contagious, especially as the world has really nothing better to offer. So I think that, I definitely think that it's super, super bullish. This was a bear market conference, but it was a pretty big bear market conference.
Yeah, well, I just have some technical difficulties here. I tried to reset my camera to HD, and now it looks like it kicked me out. So let me try to real quick.
Yeah, just leave and come back. I'll entertain everyone.
Leave and come back. Okay.
So I want to tell everyone here about the newest Bitcoin magazine. We currently have 500 of these awesome El Salvador President Bukele themed collectible bills that we are sending out with new subscribers to the new Bitcoin magazine. So you're going to get the upcoming Orange Party issue and then the next 3 issues, plus the collectible bill. I wish I had one on me. I cannot wait to get my hands on this magazine and on this collectible bill. But yeah, I mean, y'all are going to want to get your hands on this. And honestly, just go to the Bitcoin magazine store. We are loaded with awesome swag, collectibles, stickers, you know it. We recently dropped a awesome corduroy hat, Satoshi Nakamoto, in 2 different colors, brown and black. So Kayne West recently was pictured wearing a very, very similar hat. So if you want to get on that Satoshi Nakamoto vibe, go to the Bitcoin magazine store, store.b.tc store.bitcoinmagazine.com, my bad, and use BM Live to get a discount, obviously. All right, Ansel, we can see you. You're back. Should we get into the show?
Yes. Okay. So first up, let's get into the Bitcoin chart. Let's pull that up first. Of course, that keeps us grounded. You keep us grounded, Christian, on Bitcoin. You being so intertwined in the industry, you keep us always grounded on Bitcoin. But starting here, you can just see we're in this pattern. We're going sideways. We've been at this price level around 19,000, 19,500 since June 18th. So over 120 days, I believe that is. And we're just keeping grinding sideways. I'm kind of waiting until we see what happens when we run into this red line, this trend line, and see if that is some sort of signal that that's time to buy. We're going to break out from here. Again, when I look at the price chart, when I look at the some of the indicators on like the weekly time frame and other things, I just don't see a lot of bearish momentum. Even though we're sitting at the bottom, I don't believe we have any risk of like a cascade liquidation to take us all the way down to some of the levels that people are talking about. It's just a very, I think, encouraging consolidation compared to, say, the stock market, compared to other things. The volatility is very low. And so I think all in all, the last couple months has actually been very positive and shown that Bitcoin can hold on, can be strong. And it's not a speculatively driven market, at least completely. It is, of course, there is a lot of that. But this price has held on even despite all of the geopolitical stuff that's happened since June. We're still sitting at 19,000. So what are your thoughts on the price for the last few months?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see it consolidate like this. I do feel like we are probably in for another leg down. So maybe when we hit that trend line, that's what happens. I think that there just needs to be a little bit more pain. But beyond that, I do think that Bitcoin has been impressive. Like, it's catching eyes. The haters are seeing it behave differently than pretty much all other assets. And I don't think other assets, I mean, obviously a lot of other institutional assets, they kind of have that regular bid from savings,
Passive.
passive investing. So I don't think Bitcoin's passive bid is the same, but maybe it's more of an active passive bid, if you will, by enthusiasts who are very, very convicted. So it might be, maybe it's not as big. It might be better. I think if Bitcoin tanks, the enthusiasts are going to buy it all up as quickly as possible. And I think that's hopefully when we see some strength. But ultimately, if things continue to get worse in the macro sphere, we're seeing a lot of leading indicators that the U.S. economy is probably going to get worse. People are going to lose jobs. People are going to struggle. It's going to be difficult for people to accumulate, and maybe they'll even have to part with their Bitcoin at untimely prices. So just something to think about.
What's your take on the all-time high hash rate? It's just surging. It's kind of going exponential right now. So we have this huge surge in hash rate, which of course requires a lot of energy, or not a lot, but it requires energy during these high energy price times. And it doesn't seem to be daunting Bitcoin at all. I think that's another huge signal that there isn't, the bearishness, I think, is just, it's overplayed. It's overstated. If you look at all of the metrics in Bitcoin, everything is going up except the price. So what's your thoughts on the energy and the mining?
Yeah, I mean, it's really going to be interesting to see how inefficient miners are going to continue to deal with this ultra low hash price. I was listening to Rabbit Hole Recap last week, great show by Marty Bent and Matt Odell, and they were talking about Bitmain, like putting on some new very high powered machines that are ultra competitive, and that skyrocketing the hash rate. Antpool has been mining a large portion of blocks recently. So yeah, I mean, there's the beautiful thing about Bitcoin mining economics is that they're the most competitive in the world, and every inefficiency is going to get squeezed out. It's going to, again, like I said, it's going to be really interesting to see that play out. We may see hash rate dip a little bit depending on how bad things go for some of these businesses. But at the same time, it's very, if there are new gen machines that can hash even better, eventually they're going to make their way out. So
where do they do most of their mining?
I would not be the right person to answer that question. Maybe we need to get a mining expert on. I mean, obviously, China and that general region is kind of where they've historically been able to mine. So maybe that is reemerging. I don't know. That's
Central
just pure
Asia, maybe.
speculation. Pure speculation. So, but who knows? Maybe a big sovereignty is jumping in too. Maybe, I don't know. There's
rumors
there's
of
a
Russia,
lot,
right?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that could be happening on that front. But I tend to agree with you. I think Bitcoin's price, the difference between Bitcoin and assets is that as the economy gets worse, it doesn't matter as long as Bitcoin continues to have utility. Eventually, that utility, people using it plus scarcity equals price will go up. And that has no speculation whatsoever. So that doesn't, interest rates don't affect that. But for now, I think that utility and scarcity, it hasn't taken hold quite yet. So I'm curious to what you think about Bitcoin's progress and how it will shake out.
Well, yeah, in these times there has been a rush for cash, right? That's why the dollar, we're going through like a dollar shortage, even though we have been told that there's been so much money printing. But the dollar is going up in value because people run towards safety and they run towards cash. Well, Bitcoin is way safer than dollar, and it's becoming very, very stable here at 19,000. So I think the more stable it becomes, the more that puts that safe haven bid in play. And we see things like gold crashing recently, but Bitcoin is staying rock solid. We see the stock market having volatile swings, yet Bitcoin stays rock solid. So it almost is like they're, slowly but surely, it's going to be seen as a safe haven bid, just like the dollar. And of course, that I say that that is the ultimate showdown, is Bitcoin versus the dollar eventually.
Should we go to the next chart?
Yeah. Okay. Next one up is stock market. I just put this in here. I am a Bitcoin bull, but I'm also a stock market bull. I think a lot of the stuff in the U.S. economy is overly bearish, and I don't think that the next little while is going to be super bearish. I think we're going to, throughout the rest of the year, we're going to either form a bottom or we're going to start heading back up. And this time next year, we could be pushing back towards all-time highs. If you go to the next slide, that is just the dollar indices. So the green one is the DXY. And remember, that is heavily weighted against the euro 60% and the yen about 15%. And the pound, I think it's about 10% of that one. So it's very heavily weighted towards these other kind of larger currencies. But the black line is the broad trade weighted dollar, which is against 30 or so other currencies, including the Chinese yuan, the Mexican peso, and some of these other ones that are, big trading partners. And for a long time, the trade weighted dollar had not broken out above its COVID highs. But just in the last couple of weeks now, it really has taken out those highs and is going much higher. And I put that down to the Japanese yen and the Chinese yuan are the currencies that are really kind of devaluing right now against the dollar. So it seems to be the East Asian currencies that are having the worst performance over the last couple of weeks. Of course,
Well, they're taking turns, right?
They are. Yeah, they are kind of taking turns. But the euro is kind of stable over the last couple of weeks. The pound had a really bad like 2 or 3 weeks, but it has also been stable. It actually rebounded from like 103 all the way up to 112. So we'll see how that develops over the next little while. If you go to the next slide, this is what these East Asian currencies looks like. This is the Japanese yen. It's pushing up to 150 against the US dollar. Just really, really bad debasement. Even though when you look at their inflation rate or their CPI, it's still like 1%. So Japan, even though they have this big dollar problem, this big devaluation of the yen, their official CPI is still very low. I'm interested to see how this develops. I have some theories, but don't want to go into those right now. Let's see what else we got. That's it for the charts. Yeah, well, this is the 10-year gilt. I'm going to go into that when we talk about the UK. But CK, do you have any thoughts on currencies like the dollar?
I want to talk to you about real estate in the United States.
Okay.
So, I mean, I've been seeing a lot of speculation of real estate is the next area to take a really big hit. You've been seeing really like viral screenshots from Reddit where homeowners are saying like don't like almost like hodl your house, like don't let them squeeze you, like they'll go up eventually. This kind of like mentality, the cope phase of a crypto bear market instilling. I'm curious what, you're bullish on stocks, you're bullish on Bitcoin. Is that really kind of focused in on this idea that the Fed will like put in a hefty pivot and change course? Or can you explain that bullishness, and does that extend to what I would say has been a very stable market, which is the real estate market, but also a market that seems to be teetering there and being very top heavy?
Yeah. So the fundamental theory here is that, well, first off, the Fed doesn't control anything. So the Fed will follow what the market is doing. And I think the market is experiencing some financial stress, like we see with the stuff going on in the UK. We've had rumors and stuff about Credit Suisse. The Fed is starting swap lines to the Swiss National Bank and stuff like that. So there is some signs of financial stress in the system, and that will force people back into U.S. Treasuries and push down interest rates, and that will force the Fed to pivot. If you look back at 2019, the market led the Fed. So the rates started going down, and then the Fed caught up. And that's exactly what is going to happen again. The Fed will probably continue to raise rates. I don't know at what speed, but they will continue to raise rates until the market turns against them, until, the 10-year and the 2-year, everything is crashing down in the yields, and then the Fed will pivot. Now, going towards the housing market, if that is the case, that yields inevitably will come back down, and I think probably sooner rather than later, the stock market will, or the housing market will get bid again. If you look globally at real estate markets around the world, and historically big real estate bubbles, the U.S. housing market is not in probably the top 5 housing markets in the world. So there's a lot of room to go higher over the next decade. So until the housing market is disrupted by Bitcoin, and by that I mean some of the store of value bid that is in housing goes into Bitcoin, then I think the U.S. housing market is going to continue going higher.
Okay. Yep. And I know that that's how you feel about the Fed. So thank you for re-explaining it. But it's definitely good to think of it full circle. And if you're right, it'll be very interesting. Here's another prediction here on Fedwatch.
Oh boy. All right, let's jump into the UK stuff. I did not look at the Fed schedule, man. I know I told you I was going to have a list of Fed schedule. I know their FOMC is coming up November 2nd. And then they have one more, I believe, by the end of the year. I'm not sure the date, in December. So we're 2 weeks away from the next FOMC decision. And I do think it'll probably be 75 basis points. But again, if the rates turn around, if there's too much financial stress, then imagine if they go to 25. I think that would be a huge bid to the stock market, a huge bid to Bitcoin. So anyway, so the other update I have is the UK, and I wanted to go a little bit through the timeline and talk about some of the things that happened. Are you up to date on what's going on with the UK?
At a very high level, and I'll have to admit to the audience that we definitely aren't experts in all the nuances that are happening in that market. So please forgive us for any slight inaccuracies, but we'll try to keep it high level to try to just go through whatever the drama is there in terms of yes QE, no QE, a minister getting the head of the central bank getting fired, loss of faith in the prime minister very, very quickly. Obviously, things are kind of in shambles there. And it's very interesting to observe UK politics. Leaders come and go much more quickly at some times than they do in other places. So it's very interesting to kind of see.
Yeah, they're about to sack their second prime minister this year, like in a matter of 3 months. So that's pretty crazy. But yeah, I also wanted to put out a disclaimer. I've been watching China a lot more with the 20th Party Congress, which we're going to go into here in a second. So I haven't been following the UK stuff as much, but I did want to go through a quick timeline. So if you pull up that chart there, Chris, which was the 10-year gilt. That is, as you can see, over the last few months from August, the 10-year rate over there was all the way down at 1.8%. And then in a matter of 2 months, it shot all the way up to 4.6%. And it really got out of hand in the last 2 weeks of the third quarter. And if you remember on the show here, in the past, I've said, the end of the third quarter is when there was a lot of financial stress in the system. And so guess what they started right before the end of the third quarter? They started QT. Now, what kind of idiot starts QT right at like the most intense time of financial stress of the whole calendar year? These idiots did that. And so that shot the interest rates all the way up to 4.6 on the 10-year. And that was September 28th. The BOE, or the Bank of England, came out and said, we're going to intervene with our open market operations, whatever we're doing. It's not technically QE because it was centered around repo transactions. And it's really similar to what the Fed did in 2019 with the repo rumble, and what they did a lot of going into 2020. So it's technically not QE, but it is QE. Anyway, then they expanded that up to 10 billion pounds per day in reverse repos and accommodation, I guess you could call it, on the 3rd of October. And we kind of talked about this on that Fedwatch that I think we did on the 5th of October. Then they said their bond buying program was going to end on the 14th, and nobody believed them. Nobody believed that they could actually end it. And of course, then they brought it to a close. They stopped doing their accommodative stuff, and now they say they're actually going to turn back QE back on November 1st. So that's kind of where we're at. And then in all of this kind of turmoil, there was this maybe correlated activity with the Fed and the Swiss National Bank. You probably read some headlines. There was a $3 billion swap line on one day, and then a few days later, there was a $6 billion swap line. So for a total of $9 billion. And we don't know who exactly it went to, because the Swiss National Bank, does these swap lines for other people that request these bailouts. We do know that it was around 18 entities. It's anonymous, but we know it's around 18 entities. So it wasn't all Credit Suisse, but it could have been anybody. It could have been banks in England. It could have been other European banks. It doesn't have to be just Swiss banks that go to the Swiss National Bank. And what I think is interesting to think about is, if you're like some London bank and you need to get a swap line, what the Bank of England isn't going to go during all of this turmoil and say, hey, Fed, we need a swap line. That would tank market sentiment even more, cause even more panic. Maybe they went to the ECB and the ECB said, no, our market's too fragile. So the next closest place was the Swiss National Bank. So it could have been any of these players from around Europe that went in and requested bailouts from the Fed via the Swiss National Bank. But anyway, all of this stuff got pretty crazy. There was a lot of panic in the market, but it has since kind of resolved. Now, a lot of people, I was the one saying I think that there was going to be contagion from this, and we should be watching out. It does not appear to be that way right now, but like we saw in the Great Financial Crisis, when one bank has problems and it looks like there's no contagion, right? They say, Bernanke famously said, this is contained. Well, it's not really contained, because what has happened is that the entire sentiment of the market has shifted to being more fragile. And I think that's what this has done. But for the time being, I think it is papered over, and there will be a slight recovery, and we'll just wait for the next shoe to drop, probably around the end of the first quarter. That's what I got for the UK.
The clown show continues, man. It's interesting. Can't get over the central planners. Whatever they're doing, they're typically making things worse. And it's, again, I think the best metaphor yet came from Fedwatch a few years back, but the monetary hurricane. So they're just adding to the
Absolutely.
craziness, the inability to forecast what's actually happening in the economy with their central planning. So that's the biggest woe there.
Yep. So that's all I have for the UK. Hopefully I can do a better update here in coming weeks if there's more to come from that. But let's move on to China. So China had the 20th Party Congress, and this is not getting a lot of headlines. You know, like what's happened in the UK, what's happening with the European energy stuff is getting a lot more headlines. But the 20th Party Congress, I think, is the biggest geopolitical event of the year and the biggest macro event of the year. Maybe of a few decades, because China being the second largest economy, let's see what they talk about in their 5-year plans and what they tell you about their policies going forward. I think it's a very, very important milestone for the global economy, and there hasn't been a lot of headlines. So what I did was I asked Chris to put in the description to the video today of the entire transcript of Xi's speech. It's a 2-hour speech, and I was going to try to pull out a few quotes from that, but it was too long, and there wasn't any specific spot that I could pull out that made sense out of context. But I do want to say that they used the term Marxism like 26 times in there. They used the term distribution or redistribution of income. All of these Marxist calling cards. So for anybody that doesn't think that China is truly Marxist and communist, just go read Xi's speech there. And I mean, it drips off the page with Marxist Leninist stuff. I mean, he says those exact words, that China is a Marxist Leninist country. So anyway, I do have some quotes, however, from a Blackrock blog post. And I think that's the next slide up, Chris. So this is just a blog post from a couple days ago on the Blackrock website. So this is going out to Blackrock clients. These high-powered investors, high net worth individuals are reading this blog. And the title is China's Growth Challenges Go Beyond COVID. If you go to the next slide, what I did was I pulled out a few quotes. And I think this is very important, so I'm just going to read these out here. China's export growth has already been slowing markedly since July. We think the volume of exports could actually shrink by 6% on average in 2022 and 2023, translating into nominal export growth of just 3%. So let that sink in. The volume of exports out of China are going to decrease 6% this year and next year. That's 12% total, roughly. And nominally, yes, there's slight growth, but the volume of it, people are cutting China out of the global economy. Let me continue. So instead of making a positive contribution to overall economic growth of 1.8% in 2020 and 2021, exports could make a negative contribution of 1.1% this year and next. And then see the chart. So if you go to the chart, actually, Chris, it's in the next slide. So you can see that 1.8% is adding to growth, and then they have this 1.1% negative. So to make up the difference, what they're saying is there needs to be domestic demand growth. There needs to be productivity growth in China, and we're not seeing that. If you can go back, slide number 7, Chris. All right, so continuing. Losing that huge growth driver will make maintaining overall economic growth quite the challenge. All else equal, economic growth next year would have to be a substantial 2.9% slower overall. Given the loss of export demand, the only way to achieve a steady growth rate of 5%, roughly in line with the authorities' target in 2022 and 2023, would be to almost double the growth rate of domestic demand. That could change afterwards, but we shouldn't expect too much. Sorry, I'm having a small print. I can't see it too well. Why we don't expect a major change in the political landscape, and the current authorities have shown themselves to be pretty cautious about implementing policies to boost growth, unlike their predecessors who went all out during the financial crisis. In recent years, the government has typically aimed for the minimum possible support, as it worries about pro-growth policies resulting in too much debt, artificially inflated asset prices, or greater income inequality. When facing a trade-off between growth today and risks that could have a big effect tomorrow, the government has prioritized future stability. So what this is saying is, they just don't have, everything is lining up against them. They have a very high debt. It's actually the highest debt to GDP ratio in the world if you include public and private debt. They have the worst demographics in the world, which we'll get into here in a second. And they have this inflation problem. So there is, their currency is weakening. So they have all of these things they cannot stimulate. Yet that's where all their growth is supposed to come from. And I want to reiterate, this is BlackRock, the BlackRock blog, who I don't particularly like BlackRock in the grand scheme of things, but I understand that they're big heavyweights in the world, and this is coming straight from their blog. So if we could go to slide number 9, please. Well, let me stop there. CK, do you have anything to add or anything you thought about that section before I get to the next section?
No, nothing in particular. I love to chime in how we've been early about talking about what is wrong with China. While a lot of people say China is the new rising power, even earlier this year, for over a year, maybe even 2, we've been pointing out the issues with a state and country that identifies as Leninist and communist, and how that will not be able to compete against a market system. So the fact that a BlackRock, which I think for the most part has been kind of aligned with a pro Chinese thesis, is now turning around. I think that is really telling, because that's when, all support kind of goes away, and people really accept that there's some issues here. And frankly, just seeing how the CCP is kind of acting and prolonging COVID when the rest of the world has kind of given into normalcy for the most part, it's affected their ability to export, which the world is just going to route around that. There's a lot of countries that are willing and able to take that production mantle on. Obviously, it's not easy to just pick up and go, but it's already been a trend, and that trend can just accelerate.
Absolutely. All right, let's go to the next one, slide number 9. So more fundamentally, the authorities don't have as much room to boost growth aggressively, even if they wanted to. Previous periods of slower growth, like in 2000, 2008, and 2015, came alongside rapidly increasing productive capacity, which drove inflation down. That's not the case this time, which suggests that China's potential output, the amount it can produce before inflation starts to surge, is lower now. COVID controls are reducing potential output today. While they might be eased, we still think the potential growth rate of the Chinese economy might have fallen below 5% and could fall further. Sorry, motorcycle drove by. Could fall further, around 3% by the turn of the decade. Now, I'll add here that no, it's by the turn of the decade, if the exports are dropping 6% a year in volume, there's no way they're going to keep a 3% growth rate, even for the next 2 years. So by the end of the decade, I think we're going to see that in the next 2 years. Why? They ask why. Most importantly, the working age population, having grown rapidly, is now shrinking. And we'll see a chart here in a second. Fewer workers mean the economy cannot produce as much without generating inflation, unless productivity growth accelerates. But we think international trade and tech restrictions, as well as tighter regulations on companies operating in China, will dampen productivity growth. So now let's go to the next slide. And this is just a chart of the working age population. And you can see in 2020, it went below 0. And there's a little spike up here about 2025, but then it drops very negative. And this is the fastest shrinking population in the history of the world. They are going to get old way before they get rich. So very important demographics. The demographics is working against them. Okay, next slide. Now, this is the conclusion of this blog post. So putting all this together, we don't think China policymakers will take aggressive measures to boost growth. It's possible the removal of COVID controls could give a bigger than expected boost if it happens more quickly, but there's no clear indication of pace yet. Looking through the COVID ups and downs, we think the slowing demand and grudging policy offsets as supply growth slows means growth will average significantly below pre-pandemic rates in coming years. That will have knock-on effect on the rest of the world. In the past, when countries faced a slowdown, they could still rely on Chinese consumers and companies to buy up their cars, chemicals, machinery, fuel, even as consumers at home tighten their belts. And they could rely on China to continue supplying an abundance of cheap products as China's rapidly growing working population enabled it to keep production costs low. Not so anymore. Recession is looming now for the US, UK, and Europe, but this time China won't be coming to its own or anyone else's rescue. So that is the blog post from Blackrock. Any closing thoughts before we move on to Michael Pettis?
It is interesting to kind of hear about how this is going to affect the U.S. and other nations. You know, obviously, China has been a massive force in the global economy for a long time, pretty much the entire, all of the 2000s. And so, you know, the last 20 years or so. You know, I know that you kind of have some theories there, why that's good for the U.S., why that's good for localism, why that's good for other developing nations. But in the immediate term, it's going to have some pains. Ansel, what are you going to say?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily good for those things. I think that it will lead to those things, you know, inevitably. So I think that the way that the market is going, the way that the world is going, the way that human society and the global economy is evolving is beyond anyone's control. And I mean, it doesn't matter how we feel about it, right? It is going to happen. We're going to a multipolar world, if you can call it that, or a multi-regional world. And that will have spill-on, knock-on effects towards localism and also towards trust minimizing currency, which is one of the big bids under Bitcoin. You know, trade between these regions, these powers aren't going to trust each other. Well, you need a currency that is trusted, that, you know, that embodies that trust so that there can be trade between these regional powers in the world. They're not going to accept credit. Okay, China's credit is not going to be good in the US or Europe. Russian credit definitely isn't going to be good in Europe. So there's, you know, these regional powers need a neutral currency to trade with, and that is part of Bitcoin's story for sure. But let's move on real quick to, did you have something else to add? No.
Nope,
okay.
Let's move on. I agree.
Yep. All right, we're running short on time, so we're probably not going to be able to get to the European stuff. Maybe we can touch on it briefly before we
can do it. 12 more minutes. Let's go.
We have to bounce. Okay, so this is Michael Pettis, and he is, if you guys aren't following on Twitter, make sure you follow Michael Pettis. I can't remember his handle. I think it's Michael X Pettis or something like that on Twitter. And he is a professor at Beijing University, I believe. Pretty well-known and well-established economist that's working over there in China. And I just love the stuff that he puts out. But here, this is what a tweet thread he put out about what's happening here between provincial governments or regional governments and the CCP in Beijing. So he's quoting from an article, and he says, quote, "The Ministry of Finance said government-backed entities would be strictly prohibited from purchasing land by raising debt last week, describing the practice as a sham," end quote. The Ministry of Finance is right, of course, but this doesn't address the original problem. Allowing local governments to reverse the decline in land sales revenue by setting up SPVs to buy land from themselves was simply a way for them to borrow money and pretend the proceeds were actually land sale revenues. This was extremely risky because, among other things, it meant that the local governments were effectively doubling down on their already excessive exposure to the real estate market. The Ministry of Finance was absolutely right to clamp down on this practice. Next slide. But local governments are desperate. Their revenues have dropped sharply, even as their expenses have risen. What is more, they are expected to fund a wave of growth next year. The Ministry of Finance stopped them from faking revenues without addressing the reasons they had to do so. Beijing must know how difficult the circumstances are that local governments face, and yet isn't doing much to help. I think we are probably seeing the beginning of what over the next few years will be a very contentious relationship between local governments and Beijing. And I'll say that his analysis here agrees with what the Blackrock was saying, is that they don't have room to do stimulus. All they're doing is they're clamping down on these faulty accounting practices, but not addressing the underlying issue. And they probably won't. And so Michael Pettis here this is a big statement saying that there's going to be a contentious relationship between local governments and Beijing. Now, the history of China does not like contentious relationships between local governments and the ruling power. You know, the most of the history is warring states. It's rare to have a consolidated China. And so that's one thing I've been saying too, that the risk of kind of revolution is not zero over there. And Michael Pettis is saying that right here. I mean, he might not have intended to say that, but that's what I think people that are at least amateur students of history will read that statement and be like, oh, damn, there's some risk of China actually having social upheaval. So what do you think of what Michael Pettis there said?
Very interesting. There's already been social upheaval. There's been a lot of social upheaval already. And we don't even see the majority of it, but it's happened with these banks. It's happened with people not wanting to repay their loans. It's happened with people saying that they're not going to make their payments on the real estate that they're waiting to get built that's not getting built. We're seeing on social media people like using humor to get around the CCP censorship. You know, obviously there's a black market for Bitcoin mining and Bitcoin itself in China. So I think we've already seen social upheaval, and it's likely just to get worse. But again, this is kind of the problem with like these mandated growth from governments, these expectations with socialism. It just does not work. So it's going to create contention. And I think people are going to look fondly at the days when markets were a little bit more free to operate in China and ask, why are we doing this?
Absolutely. All great points. Okay, so we have a few minutes left. Let's try to get through some of this stuff from Europe. So this slide here is the Dutch natural gas futures. This is the front month contract, and you see it's just really dropping hard here. I wanted to compare that to the U.S. contract. So you can see the price there is what, 113 on the Dutch. And if you go to U.S. nat gas, it's at 5. So there is a huge discrepancy, but also the price here in the U.S. is crashing as well for natural gas, not just oil. So oil is down at around $85 a barrel. So energy in general, the futures contracts are trading much lower, much more in line with normal. Now, we did have Andreas on. If you go to the next slide, we did have Andreas on a couple weeks ago. And the reason why I got him on was because he was talking some sanity. You know, he was trying to fight the Armageddon narrative in the European energy crisis going on. And I was trying to do similar, talking about the dollar. And so I wanted to get him on it and pick his brain on that. But here, this is a tweet thread from, I think, this morning. And I wanted to read through a few of these things. So he says the gas and electricity prices are dropping fast in Europe right now, and they are likely going to drop further. What's going on? Natural gas prices have dropped from greater than 300 euros per megawatt hour to levels just north of 50 euros. And day ahead prices are even lower in many areas of Europe. Next. This is a chart of the natural gas futures like I just had with the Dutch contracts, but also he has the German in here, the German one. But prices in Spain, he says, have dropped as low as 27 euros per megawatt hour for gas, as there is currently a queue of ships waiting to offload outside of Spanish LNG ports. Next slide. So this one, damn, the print is really small. This has led LNG within day prices to trade sub 25 in Spain. Next slide. Again, here's the Dutch natural gas futures. Fill levels in European gas storages are approaching 100%, way ahead of the deadline of 1 November, and paired with milder than usual weather. This leads to very low net spot demand for gas. And actually, I paired this with the wrong chart. So if you go to the next slide, this is the chart of the storage. And you can see Hungary is the only laggard here. But of course, Hungary is also the only European country that's still getting Russian gas. I think actually Italy is still getting some Russian gas, but Hungary is the main one. So they're the only one that is below this 80% threshold. So he says Germany is, for example, still running large daily net injections into storage through mid-October as 1, the flow is decent, 2, the temperatures are mild, and 3, natural gas consumption among households and industry it's below 2021 levels. So if you go to the next slide. So this is the German natural gas chart showing the demand by season. And the orange line is the current, storage. And so you can see it's very high, getting ready for winter. There is hence very limited scarcity risks for October, November, and the arrow points clearly down for prices as a consequence. LNG ships are queuing up, and there is nowhere to place it. Now we're starting to get to a situation like in April of 2020 when the oil futures went to zero. They actually went negative because we had a situation there where all of the storage tanks were full. All the storage tanks were full, and many of the large oil tankers were actually just sitting offshore full. So there was nowhere to take physical delivery. So everybody that had a oil contract, they had to dump it. They had to dump it at any price because they couldn't take delivery. There was nowhere to store it. There was nowhere to put the gas or to put the oil. And so they had to dump the contracts, and that's why it went to zero. Now we're coming to a similar situation in a crazy twist of fate here. We're coming to the same damn situation with LNG. These ships are sitting queued up offshore. What happens when these futures contracts come for delivery and these tanks are full, the ships are full, waiting to unload? I mean, it could, seriously, the price could drop to zero on some of these LNG contracts. It's just crazy what has happened to this energy market. But let's go to the next one. And this is the last one. So, oh man, the print is very tiny. I'm not going to be able to read that. This is likely going to bring the entire natural gas and electricity curve down in coming weeks, at the very least until the heating season really kicks in through November. The Armageddon scenario is, for now, not worth talking about. And then he talks about 2023, how there still could be some knock-on effects in 2023. And I think that is also the case. But it looks like for this winter, for the next couple months, we could have an energy crisis in Europe with prices at zero. Let that sink in. How disrupted is this market? It is an absolute clown show. All right. Back to you, CK.
I was thinking clown show too. So, God, you guys, political actions does crazy ass shit to markets. It really does. You just gotta let the markets work. You gotta get out of the way.
The markets are trying to heal themselves right now. They're trying to cause some pain to people because they have to heal themselves. That's the problem. But we're bumping up on time, man. Any closing comments for today?
Y'all, I'm sorry for my lack of enthusiasm on the show. Definitely deep in sickness right now, but we'll be better next week. Excited to come back, and there's going to be a lot more of the clown show in
Yep.
Clown World to unpack from a macro perspective here. I want to give a quick shout out to the breakup. Look up Count BTC on Twitter and on YouTube. But my man Nolan Bowley is going live every single day and talking about Clown World. And yeah, I mean, he used to be on Bitcoin Magazine Live. He is back, y'all. He goes on at 8 a.m. Eastern every single day. And
Awesome.
I've been loving what he's doing. So check that out. I think the two most high quality, high signal shows there are Fedwatch and the breakup. So check that out. And for everyone wishing me to get better, thank you very much. I appreciate it. The love, I feel the love through the comments.
I see you're drinking tea. You're getting your hydration.
I'm hydrated, man. I'm trying.
All right. Yeah. For me, guys, just follow me on Twitter at Ansel Lindner. Check out my Telegram, t.me/Bitcoin and markets. I live stream every weekday now on Telegram, and I'm simulcasting that to Twitter Spaces. So check that out, and check out bitcoinandmarkets.com for my free weekly newsletter. That's it, guys.
Let's go. Peace.